Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we're peeling back the heavy velvet curtains of royal history to find something unsettling. Behind the gold-plated thrones and jewel-encrusted crowns, you'll find monarchs with habits so bizarre, so baffling, that they might just twist your dreams tonight. We're talking about rulers whose personal rituals could make a horror director wince and a therapist retire early. But don't worry, you're safe here. They probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where are you watching from and what time is it? Midnight in Madrid? 3 a.m. in Tokyo? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It begins with teeth, or rather, the lack of them. Empress Anna of Russia, ruling in the early 18th century, had a smile that could make a mirror crack. Not from beauty, unfortunately, but because she had lost nearly all her teeth by her mid-30s. Some say it was syphilis, others whisper it was scurvy or even mercury poisoning thanks to the medical treatments of the time. Either way, she didn't hide her gummy grin. No, she flaunted it like it was the newest fashion trend. Court life under Anna took a strange turn. She reportedly ordered that no one in her presence wear false teeth. Those who dared to flash a full smile risked offending her. The result? A gaggle of nobles gumming their food in forced solidarity, slurping soup like toddlers and awkwardly grinding roast duck with molars that had seen better centuries. At her royal banquets, the crunchiest foods, nuts, apples, toasted bread, were mysteriously absent. Everything was boiled, mashed, or turned into a suspicious pudding. Now picture this: a grand marble hall in St. Petersburg, chandeliers flickering in candlelight, music from a harpsichord echoing through the space, and dozens of aristocrats sucking on mashed parsnips because the empress didn't like the sound of chewing. It sounds like satire, but historians agree. Anna wielded her influence over the minutiae of court life with tyrannical flair. Here's the odd twist. She considered her missing teeth a symbol of authenticity, a divine mark. She even claimed that Peter the Great, her uncle, appeared to her in a dream and praised her natural face. Royal portrait painters were ordered to depict her accurately, sunken cheeks and all. Not surprisingly, most of those paintings mysteriously disappeared after her death. And then there's the tale of the Toothless Ball, an infamous event she hosted one snowy February evening. Guests were required to come without wigs or makeup, and most critically to remove any artificial teeth they possessed. Servants handed out gauze masks soaked in clove oil to numb the discomfort of exposed gums. Dinner was a warm porridge course, followed by pureed venison and something politely labelled jellied eel surprise. Imagine the sounds in that room: soft sucking, lip smacking, and the occasional whimper of someone trying to chew a mushroom with no front teeth. Modern dental historians, yes, that's a thing, still debate the psychological roots of Anna's aversion. Was it insecurity turned into power projection? A rebellion against the French beauty standards infiltrating Russian high society? Or perhaps it was simply her way of keeping the court off balance, literally unable to bite back. Scholars still argue whether Anna's dental tyranny was a calculated political tool or a sad consequence of chronic pain and decaying health. Of course, she wasn't the only monarch to turn oral hygiene into a battlefield. Louis XIV, the Sun King of France, famously had such severe dental issues that his teeth rotted in place, infecting his sinuses and leaving a permanent sulphurous stench. But unlike Anna, Louis kept smiling, albeit behind a fan and a thick cloud of lavender perfume. Anna leaned into the horror of it. There's a disturbing intimacy in the way rulers weaponize their appearances. In Anna's case, her missing teeth became a mirror for the crumbling opulence of her court. Her palace was grand, yes, but drafty and perpetually under construction. Her court was rich but riddled with spies and backstabbing cousins. The empress herself was known for fits of irrational cruelty. Most famously, she once forced a noble couple to spend their wedding night in an ice palace, complete with a frozen bed, as punishment for crossing her. The bride nearly died of exposure, and the groom, well, he never quite spoke again. One fringe account found in a German traveller's diary claims that Anna kept a collection of extracted noble teeth in a velvet-lined box beside her bed. She allegedly called it her cabinet of obedience. Whether this is true or just an elaborate metaphor has never been confirmed. But the box was said to rattle faintly when the wind howled outside her chambers. Fast forward to her later years, and Anna grew even more eccentric. With her health in decline, she stopped attending court entirely and issued decrees from a darkened chamber while sipping lukewarm broth. Attendants say she began mumbling to her lost teeth, as if each one represented a traitor or failed lover. "You cracked under pressure," she once muttered to a molar before tossing it into the fireplace. She died in 1740, alone except for her jester and a muttering priest. Her legacy is often overshadowed by the more charismatic figures of Russian history, like Catherine the Great. But if you look closely, you'll find Empress Anna's toothless imprint across an entire generation of aristocrats who learned to smile softly, chew slowly, and never ever bring an apple to the royal table. In a way, her story is a cautionary tale about vanity's revenge and the eerie power of one person's discomfort to reshape the habits of hundreds. It's also oddly comforting, because no matter how weird your dinner table habits may be, chances are you've never hosted a gum-only feast for 300 nobles. And somewhere in the cold archives of Moscow, perhaps tucked behind layers of dust and frost, there may still be that little velvet box, waiting quietly, teeth whispering their secrets into the silence. The Empress with her toothless tyranny may have reigned in silence, but centuries before her, another woman chose a very different method of command, one soaked in rosewater, blood, and the unmistakable scent of iron. Elizabeth Bathory, the so-called Blood Countess of Hungary, occupies a special corner in the attic of European noble horrors. Living in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, she was born into unimaginable wealth and influence, with family ties to kings, bishops and warlords. Her castle, Chachtish, loomed high over Slovak hills, a blend of Gothic architecture and unsettling silence, the kind of place where shadows linger longer than they should. Now, history records Elizabeth as one of the most prolific female serial killers in history, but tonight we're not here to rehash court documents and confessions coaxed under torture. Instead, we're focusing on the darker habits that likely inspired the legends, and the way a royal obsession with beauty curdled into something grotesque. The tale begins, as many disturbing royal habits do, with a mirror. Elizabeth was said to be consumed by her appearance. From her early 20s, she began collecting oils, lotions, and imported perfumes from Venice and Constantinople. Her vanity table reportedly boasted over 60 small bottles, each labelled with strange little symbols, peasant herbs, bee venom, pulped pearls, but none seemed to satisfy her. Then came the moment that turned whispers into legend. A servant girl allegedly brushed Elizabeth's hair too roughly one morning, yanking a few strands. Enraged, Elizabeth struck the girl across the face. A few drops of blood landed on the countess's hand, and according to court gossip she noticed her skin beneath the droplets looked younger, smoother, almost glowing. It's probably apocryphal. Scholars still argue whether this moment happened at all. Some say it was invented by her political enemies to bring her down. Others point to Elizabeth's known medical experiments, salves, baths and tinctures, as proof that she was indeed searching for some eternal youth elixir. What isn't in question is this. From that point forward, her servants noted a shift. Basins of blood appeared in her bathing quarters. Maids were sent away with pale faces and shaky legs. Some never came back. Elizabeth took longer and longer to get ready in the mornings, and every time she emerged her skin shone unnaturally as if polished from within. Enter the bloodbath rumour. It's said Elizabeth began to bathe in the blood of young peasant girls, convinced it would preserve her beauty, and not just any girls, virgins, ideally under 16 with unspoiled blood. How she determined that? Well, let's not ponder too long. Whether literal baths occurred or the blood was applied like lotion remains debated. But contemporary records, many penned by servants under duress, describe elaborate rituals, scented candles, silver basins, a quartet of attendants applying warm fluids with brushes. Occasionally, rose petals were added to sweeten the scent. A grotesque mix of spa and slaughterhouse. It wasn't just about beauty. Elizabeth reportedly believed the blood strengthened her spirit, kept away nightmares, and warmed the bones. She suffered from chronic migraines and insomnia, and at least one surviving letter describes her drinking a tincture of animal blood mixed with gold dust and crushed sapphire. Quirky alchemy or dangerous superstition? Likely both. The horror deepened in the way her household operated. Young girls were often lured to the castle with promises of work or marriage arrangements. Some stayed just days before vanishing. Their families, powerless and fearful, dared not protest. Chattanooga had become a place of dread, a castle where the sun always seemed to set too early and the ground refused to freeze. Interestingly, Elizabeth was not alone in her habits. Other nobles of the era experimented with blood as medicine. Physicians of the time prescribed therapeutic bleeding to treat nearly everything, from colds to melancholy, and in certain circles applying the blood of virgins was thought to ward off spiritual corruption. A bizarre fad, perhaps, like medieval jade rollers, but with far darker consequences. Still, Elizabeth took it to extremes. One fringe diary claimed she even commissioned a mechanical device, dubbed the Iron Maiden's Chalice, to collect blood more efficiently from multiple donors. No such object has been found, and many modern historians dismiss it as 18th century Gothic fiction. But the fact that it was ever believed tells you something about her reputation. Eventually her exes caught up to her. Noble families began noticing their daughters missing. The King of Hungary, pressured by political allies, launched an investigation. When the authorities raided Chattanooga in 1610, what they found remains the stuff of whispered nightmares. The exact body count varies wildly, from 30 to over 600. Elizabeth was never officially tried, being a noble woman, but her accomplices were executed, and she was confined to her castle until her death. Here's the twist. There are no surviving portraits of Elizabeth from her later years. Only an early image remains, painted before the alleged blood rituals began. In it, she looks sharp-eyed, regal, and frankly unimpressed with the artist. Did she actually preserve her beauty through unspeakable means? Or did she simply descend into obsession and madness, aging like anyone else, alone, behind stone walls, haunted by a very messy skincare routine? Even more intriguing is that her family never entirely disowned her. The Bathory name retained its noble status, and Elizabeth's imprisonment was quietly handled. No public shaming, no dramatic punishment. Just silence. Almost as if the upper echelons of power preferred not to pry too deeply into her habits. After all, who among them didn't have a few secret vials tucked away? Today, Chattanooga Castle stands mostly in ruins, but tourists still visit, whispering her name and claiming to hear splashing in the baths that haven't held water in centuries, and every now and then someone swears they find a rose petal that hasn't wilted. In our modern world of collagen treatments and anti-aging serums, it's easy to scoff at Elizabeth's rituals. But beneath the horror lies a very human impulse, the desire to hold time still, to preserve beauty, relevance, power. She simply had the resources and the darkness to pursue it to its most disturbing conclusion. And while her story is often sensationalized, buried within the blood is a truth more unsettling than any legend. Royalty, when unchecked, could twist ordinary desires into monstrous rituals. A mirror, a blemish, a drop of blood, and suddenly the castle is drenched in it. It's worth remembering the fringe detail passed down by a single Czech servant who survived her employment at Chattanooga. She said the Countess never smiled, not once. Her mouth was always tight, as if she feared what would come out if it opened. In a world where beauty was power and blood was currency, perhaps Elizabeth smiled only when no one was watching, quietly in the bath, steam rising around her like a veil. We drift now from steam-drenched bloodbaths to candlelit banquet halls overflowing with meats, meads, and mayhem. The royal habit of overindulgence isn't new. Gluttony has long been the secret, or not-so-secret currency of kings. But there's a fine line between luxurious feasting and something more grotesque. And for some monarchs, that line didn't just blur, it evaporated completely. Take, for instance, King Adolf Frederick of Sweden, who lived in the 18th century and ironically is best remembered not for ruling but for eating himself to death. The story sounds like satire, but it's recorded in detail, passed down in hushed tones by historians both amused and appalled. On Fat Tuesday, 1771, the king sat down for a celebratory dinner that would become his last. His menu? Lobster, caviar, sauerkraut, smoked herring and champagne, each in generous royal portions. But the true star of the meal came at dessert. Semla buns, spiced and soaked in warm milk, a traditional Swedish treat. Adolf Frederick didn't stop at 1, or 5. He devoured 14. Now semlas are not petite pastries. their plump, cream-filled, almond paste-packed sugar bombs the size of softballs. 14 in one sitting was less a dessert and more a daring act of royal self-sabotage. By midnight, the king was groaning in pain. By morning, he was dead. Officially, the cause was digestive complications. Unofficially, historians describe it as fatal indigestion, which is just a very polite way of saying he exploded in slow motion. To this day, Swedes jokingly refer to him as the king who ate himself to death, a title that frankly belongs on a Game of Thrones episode. But Adolf Frederick wasn't the only monarch to treat food as both fuel and fatal flaw. Jump across the channel to Henry VIII of England. We know the image, wide, brocade-clad, turkey leg in hand, but it's not just legend. His waistline expanded from a svelte 32 inches in youth to an impressive 54 inches by his later years. And while modern historians often emphasise his political cunning and religious chaos, Henry's eating habits deserve their own exhibit. He reportedly consumed over 5,000 calories a day, mostly in meat and ale. No vegetables. Those were considered peasant food, or worse, medicinal. Henry preferred game, venison, swan, even peacock, served with gold-dusted gravies and wine-laced sauces. Meals stretched for hours and were punctuated by pageants, fire-breathers and acrobats dangling from the ceiling like meaty chandeliers. One favourite was something called cockentrice, a chimera dish sewn together from the front of a pig and the back of a capon, roasted whole and served with pomp. It looked like something from a medieval taxidermy shop. If dinner doesn't stare at you with pig eyes and chicken legs, were you ever truly royal? As his health declined, Henry developed leg ulcers so severe they required daily draining. His physicians blamed melancholic humours, but privately they whispered about his stomach. Always bloated, always cramping. It's said that near the end of his life his servants had to lift him onto his throne with a pulley system, and still, he insisted on feasting. Because in the Tudor court, appetite equalled dominance. There's a quirky fringe detail tucked into the records of his banquets. Henry often made guests eat more than they wanted, watching gleefully as courtiers struggled through second or third servings. Refusing was considered disrespectful. One noblewoman famously fainted after being forced to eat an entire roasted boar thigh. She awoke to Henry clapping with delight. Flash forward to France, and Louis XVIII, less famous than his Sun-King predecessor, but equally stuffed. He suffered from such chronic flatulence due to overeating that court doctors prescribed regular wind walks around the palace gardens. He was always accompanied by a valet carrying a silver bell, which the king rang when he passed gas, to alert anyone nearby that the breeze had shifted in rank. This was not an unusual precaution. In the early 1800s, some royals believed that digestive fumes, what today we'd call a polite oops, could carry disease or madness. Thus, managing one's royal emissions was considered both a medical and diplomatic responsibility. You'd think you couldn't make this up, and yet, here we are. Over in Russia, Tsar Alexander III was obsessed with power breakfasts. He began each day with a feast that included 5 boiled eggs, 3 sausages, a salted sturgeon, sour cream, and a litre of kvass, fermented bread soda that smelled like someone bottled a rainy basement. After this gut-busting spread, he would ride horseback at full gallop around his estate. Why? Because he believed violent digestion burned out cowardice. You know, like a digestive exorcism. The servants were less impressed. One diary entry notes that breakfast clean-up involved 3 chambermaids and a mop. Another servant claimed the Tsar's burps could rattle the cutlery. Modern scholars still debate whether this was exaggerated anti-monarch propaganda or simply the acoustics of his cavernous dining room. Perhaps the most astonishing part of royal overindulgence is how it filtered down. Nobles and courtiers often mimicked their sovereigns, stuffing themselves out of loyalty. At certain courts, vomiting was expected between courses, accomplished discreetly behind velvet screens called puke tents. The Romans did it too, but with less shame. At a royal dinner in Bavaria, one noble reportedly excused himself 7 times to make room for dessert. He returned each time with a bigger smile and progressively looser trousers. The stomach, it seems, was not just a digestive organ. It was a political symbol. To feast was to affirm dominance. To be full was to be above worry. To eat beyond reason was to prove that nature itself bowed to your appetite. And let's not forget the theatrics. At one banquet in Renaissance Florence, Duke Alessandro de' Medici commissioned a pie so large it contained a live, costumed dwarf who emerged mid-meal playing a flute. The Duke laughed so hard he snorted wine through his nose and fainted. When he woke, he ordered another. Of course, not every royal had an iron stomach. Queen Christina of Sweden, known for her eccentricities, reportedly refused solid food altogether for weeks at a time, living on crushed violets and watered-down beer. But even this, in its own ascetic way, was a performance. She claimed food dulled her intellect. Yet during her fasts, she would demand servants describe lavish meals to her in detail, down to the texture of the gravy. A kind of auditory indulgence, all calories removed. One particularly fringe royal, Prince Ludwig II of Bavaria, believed that eating in total silence enhanced digestion. So he built a dining room where his table rose from below the floor, preset and steaming, so he wouldn't have to see or speak to any servants. Meals were eaten alone, to music surrounded by mirrors, and yes, he talked to himself, often. Today we have dietitians and portion control. Royals had jesters with turkey hats and gravy chalices. Yet the core instinct remains, food as comfort, as status, as escape. When you control the kingdom, why not devour the menu? But the consequences were real. Many of these rulers died bloated, sickly, confined to wheeled thrones or canopied deathbeds that smelled of overcooked venison. Their doctors poked and drained, whispered and scribbled, but none could undo the damage of decades spent swallowing the world. Still, their legacies linger, both in history books and the occasional semla-eating contest in Stockholm, held every Fat Tuesday in bizarre tribute to the king who couldn't say no to dessert. And somewhere, in the silence of an old castle kitchen, perhaps the clink of a forgotten goblet echoes faintly, waiting for the next monarch to order just one more course. The night in Versailles is eerily still. Beyond the golden walls, the gardens rest under the hush of moonlight, their symmetry perfect, their silence absolute. But inside the palace, someone is screaming. Every night, without fail, the shrieks start around 3 a.m. Guards flinch, servants freeze, the chandeliers tremble with each echoing wail. The sound is raw and human, terrified, almost animal, and it's coming from the king's bedchamber. Louis XV of France, often remembered for his lavish tastes and long reign, was a man tormented by night. While his public image was painted in strokes of gold and silk, his private life was haunted by a strange and chilling phenomenon. Night terrors so intense they shook the entire royal household. Unlike nightmares which fade on waking, night terrors don't just live in dreams. They rise up in the body, full panic, full paralysis, and for Louis they were not rare, they were routine. Historians still debate the source. Was it genetic? Some believe a form of hereditary epilepsy might be to blame. Others point to early trauma. Louis became king at the age of 5, after all, during a brutal period of political upheaval. The court was filled with whispers, plots, and exiles. The boy king grew up with more spies than playmates. By the time he reached adulthood, he slept surrounded by guards, but never quite felt safe. His attacks began in his 20s. He would wake, or half-wake, screaming, drenched in sweat, eyes wide but unseeing. He'd thrash so violently that heavy tapestries were torn from the walls. One account claims a footman's wrist was broken trying to restrain him. Another servant swore he saw the king trying to climb out the window while screaming about a burning crown. The medical advice at the time was equal parts useless and weird. Physicians recommended bloodletting, lavender compresses, and listening to harpsichord music before bed. A German doctor suggested wrapping the king in wet sheets to trap the fire of madness. That lasted exactly one night. The sheets ripped, the screams worsened, and the doctor was never seen at court again. One fringe theory, largely dismissed today, claimed the king was cursed. A peasant woman, whose family was evicted from royal land, supposedly confronted young Louis and placed a moon mark on his soul. She shouted something about never sleeping in peace until the land was returned. It makes a good ghost story, but the details are murky and likely embellished by courtiers hungry for drama. Still, the king's nights were so disrupted that new rooms were constructed just for his attendants, rotating squads of physicians, valets and guards who could handle the chaos. The room next to his became known as the Chamber of Listening, where men sat in silence waiting for the first shout. One of the strangest rituals involved a bell. A small silver bell was placed on the king's nightstand. If he managed to ring it before losing control, a specific footman, trained in calming speech and rapid cloth replacement, would rush in. This footman, a man named Henri d'Almont, became somewhat of a royal sleep therapist. He developed techniques like voice anchoring and pressure grounding more than 2 centuries before psychology would give them names. Henry even kept a journal, parts of which survived. In one entry he writes, "His Majesty feared mirrors at night. They reflect not his face, he says, but his judgment." Another chilling line. "Tonight he screamed of drowning in powdered wigs. The feathers choked him. He begged the Pope to save him, though the Pope was a raven." Whether metaphor or madness, no one could say. And yet each morning Louis would rise. He'd dress in the finest silks, attend council meetings, flirt with mistresses, and preside over his gilded world as though nothing had happened. The contrast between night and day was staggering. It became a kind of open secret. Everyone knew, but no one dared speak of it. One morning, after a particularly violent episode, the king hosted a garden fête. When a duchess asked if he'd slept well, he smiled and replied, "Like a man with no past." The crowd laughed, but his valet noticed his hands were shaking under the lace cuffs. There were fringe attempts to explain or even profit from the king's nocturnal suffering. A travelling Hungarian mystic named Rakolov claimed he could extract dreams with crystals. He was invited to court and spent 3 nights attempting to draw nightmares out of the king's forehead, using amethyst stones. The only result was a very irritated rash, and a bill for 600 livres. Another theory was astrological. Royal horoscopes were taken seriously at Versailles. According to one astrologer, Louis's birth chart indicated celestial disharmony between Mars and Neptune, which supposedly fueled psychic unrest. Remedies included burying a silver coin under his pillow and never sleeping during a full moon. Predictably, this accomplished nothing except a minor mouse infestation. Still, not all the court mocked. Some felt genuine sympathy. One lady-in-waiting wrote, "The king sleeps not as other men do. He journeys nightly into lands where he is hunted." She was dismissed a few weeks later for fainting during one of his episodes. And what of his family? Queen Marie Leszczyńska kept her distance. She slept in a separate wing and reportedly wore earplugs lined with beeswax. The Dauphin, his son, tried sleeping nearby once as a gesture of filial support. He lasted 4 nights before moving back to his apartments, pale and stammering. The court nicknamed him the Dauphin of Disquiet. Toward the end of his life, Louis's episodes began to lessen, not disappear, but change. The screams became murmurs, the thrashing, tremors. Some believed age dulled his fears, others thought he simply gave up fighting them. One last tale survives, dubious but irresistible. On the final week of his life, bedridden with smallpox and wrapped in lace and linen, Louis supposedly whispered, "Tell Henri the bell is no longer needed." Henri d'Almont had retired years before and lived in a quiet cottage near the Seine. The message never reached him, or maybe it did, depending on whom you ask. Today, tourists walk through the Hall of Mirrors and marvel at the splendour. They take photos of the king's chambers, admire the embroidery, the delicate canopies, the golden trim. Few stop to imagine the cries that once rang out behind those curtains. Few know that under all that opulence was a man who, despite commanding an empire, couldn't conquer his own dreams. And perhaps that's the cruelest joke history offers. The most powerful man in Europe couldn't silence the voices in his own head. As royal screamers go, Louis XV may have reigned supreme, but across time and desert sands a quieter but no less disturbing habit bloomed inside the sacred chambers of ancient Egypt. A habit not of nightmares, but of noses. For centuries the pharaohs ruled with divinity stitched into their bloodlines. Their bodies were temples, their faces canvases for the gods, and their grooming rituals, intricate, theatrical, sometimes absurd, but none more bizarre or unexpectedly public than their dedication to nasal hygiene. In modern terms you could call it nose-plucking, but for the pharaohs it was far more than simple self-care. It was ceremony, symbolism, and, occasionally, spectator sport. In the temple cities of Thebes and Memphis, elite priests known as the hygienics of the horizon were charged with maintaining the pharaoh's physical purity. Their duties included bathing the ruler in lotus water, trimming his nails with gold shears, and most disturbingly plucking the royal nose hairs one by one during court gatherings. The belief was that nasal hairs trapped impure air that, if exhaled during divine speech, could corrupt the words of Ma'at, the goddess of truth. So before any major decree, particularly those involving law or judgment, the pharaoh would submit to the ritual cleansing of the nostrils. This wasn't done in secret. No, it was performed on a dais, in full view of the court, usually with chanting, incense and the soft twang of harp strings in the background. Imagine it. Rows of courtiers in linen robes, watching in reverent silence as two priest-groomers delicately pinch and yank tiny hairs from the divine nostrils of Pharaoh Amenhotep III. A scroll reader recites poetry about purification. Somewhere, a scribe takes notes. A servant hands the priest a silver dish to catch each hair, as if they were sacred relics. According to one carved relief in the Karnak temple complex, these nose hairs were then burned on small altars. The smoke, it was believed, carried away earthly corruption and ensured the pharaoh's next words would be untainted by human flaws. Yes, ancient Egypt believed in holy nose smoke. While this sounds like the fever dream of a beauty influencer with too much free time, there is evidence that nasal purification was a genuine facet of royal grooming. Hieroglyphs from tombs of the 18th dynasty mention the cleansing of the breath path as a necessary preparation before engaging with the gods. Some even depict miniature tools, fine tweezers shaped like ibis beaks, nestled among the treasures laid in pharaohs' tombs. Quirky, absolutely, but it fit neatly into Egyptian cosmology. The body wasn't just a vessel, it was a sacred bridge between earth and the afterlife. Cleanliness was next to godliness, and no detail was too small, not even the hairs in your nose. The ceremony's frequency depended on the ruler. Some performed it monthly, others weekly. Akhenaten, he of the sun disk obsession, reportedly underwent nasal cleansing daily at dawn, claiming it brought him closer to Aten, the solar deity. His court viewed these early morning rituals as holy meditations, but the gardeners, they reportedly just wanted the king to finish so they could water the hedges. A fringe account comes from a merchant scroll uncovered in the workers' village near Deir el-Medina. It describes a travelling nose oil vendor who claimed his liniment made extractions smooth as lotus petals. He was allegedly summoned to court once, offered a sack of barley for a private demonstration, and vanished the next day. Scholars still argue whether he was executed for being a fraud or simply joined the priesthood of hygiene. There's also the tale of Pharaoh Horemheb, who supposedly sneezed during a particularly elaborate cleansing. The sneeze sent a hair flying into the wine goblet of a visiting dignitary from Nubia. The dignitary drank it, unknowingly, and later claimed he had a vision of Osiris. The pharaoh declared the moment divine and had the goblet enshrined in a niche of his palace, where it remained, if legend is true, until the Ptolemaic era. Even in death, the nose held strange importance. Mummification involved careful removal of the brain through the nostrils. This too was considered a purification rite, though far less delicate than the plucking ceremonies. Embalmers used hooked tools, often breaking the nasal septum, which is why so many mummies have collapsed noses. A grim but oddly symmetrical end for those who once valued their nostrils so highly. In some tombs, small papyrus scrolls have been found tucked near the face. These prayers of air were incantations meant to bless the pharaoh's final breath, ensuring that even in the afterlife he would exhale wisdom unclouded by earthly impurities. They were written in poetic verse and sealed with beeswax, often scented with cedar and myrrh. The sense of smell to the Egyptians was divine. Perhaps because they knew the desert air carried more than sand. It carried memory, decay, incense, and sometimes something like God. So what can we make of all this? Historians still debate whether the nose-plucking ceremony was an actual religious practice or symbolic stagecraft, designed to reinforce the pharaoh's role as both man and god. Some argue the public rituals were a way of showing vulnerability, that even the ruler, despite his divine status, needed purification. Others think it was simply another method of keeping courtiers mesmerised and distracted from real political manoeuvring. After all, nothing kills conspiracy like the image of your king weeping quietly as a priest yanks at his nostrils. There's also the deeper symbolism. The breath, or sekhem, was viewed as life's purest essence. To cleanse the path of breath was to protect the soul. And so, whether in candlelit ceremony or quiet solitude, the pharaoh's strange little habit was not just about grooming. It was about guarding the most sacred force within him. In our modern world, where nasal trimmers and tissues abound, it's easy to scoff at all this. But maybe there's something ancient and oddly poetic in the idea that even the mightiest ruler made time to tend to the smallest, most human details of his body. Not out of vanity, but out of reverence, and who knows? Maybe one of those sacred silver dishes, once filled with nose hairs of the divine, still rests beneath a forgotten dune, waiting for the wind to uncover a fragment of ceremony, a whisper of breath, a glimmer of kingship carved in the smallest acts. If the pharaohs sniffed divinity through the burn of singed nose hairs, then the Russian tsars inhaled something far stranger, and perhaps a bit mouldy. Buried deep in the eccentric traditions of the Romanov court lies one of the oddest health fads ever recorded, the medicinal consumption of palace mould. No, not mushroom teas or noble truffles. We're talking honest-to-goodness wall mould, peeled, scraped, and, in some cases, licked straight off stone by one of the most powerful men in Eastern Europe. Enter Tsar Ivan Vest, the lesser-known co-ruler alongside his half-brother Peter the Great. While Peter was out modernising Russia with ships and shaving beards, Ivan spent much of his time indoors, plagued by chronic illness, fragile bones, and what 17th-century doctors vaguely called nerve tremors of the cold spirit, which, translated into modern terms, means absolutely nothing, and also kind of everything. In an era when medicine involved frogs in slippers and leeches with resumes, Ivan's physicians scrambled to find relief for his symptoms. One day, during a particularly damp spring, the Tsar was moved to a rarely used wing of the palace. The walls were green with a velvety film of mould, the kind you might nervously photograph in an old basement before running out and never returning. But Ivan noticed something peculiar. He claimed the air in that room eased his trembling, that breathing it made his thoughts float like feathers. So, naturally, he stayed. For weeks. He cancelled audiences, dismissed ministers, and let Peter do the heavy lifting of governance while he sat cross-legged beside the wall sniffing the fungus. At first, his attendants humoured him. After all, if a Tsar finds peace among spores, who are you to argue? But it didn't stop there. Ivan soon began instructing his court herbalist to collect samples from the walls and mix them into warm honey. The resulting paste, grey and viscous, was applied to his temples and, on particularly shivery days, spread across toast. He called it the breath of winter. His sister Sophia called it disgusting and embarrassing. One chambermaid fainted after being ordered to scrape a patch from beneath Ivan's bed and deliver it in a crystal jar. Why did he believe in it? Some claim it was tied to an old Russian folk remedy, a belief that mould from a blessed home carried healing properties. Others speculate he heard of British scientists studying penicillin precursors and attempted his own fungal medicine. A long shot, but not impossible. Cross-cultural whispers travel faster than you'd think, especially when carried by desperate physicians with few answers. Whatever the reason, Ivan became increasingly attached to his mouldy miracle. He refused to stay in any room that had been recently cleaned, believing that bleach killed the peace. Maids were forbidden from scrubbing his walls, and one poor girl who accidentally polished a sconce near his favourite patch was reassigned to snow-shovelling duty outside the palace. A clear demotion during a Russian winter. One fringe tale, found in the handwritten memoirs of an Austrian ambassador, claims Ivan once had a travelling painter decorate a wall to resemble mould after a thorough cleaning destroyed the original growth. The deception worked, until the Tsar licked the paint. He was not pleased. From then on, Ivan insisted on personally inspecting and tasting every new fungal growth in his wing. He developed a rating system: earthy, woody, sour with memory, and his favourite, taste like cold iron. His valet once caught him offering a royal guest a spoonful during tea. The guest, a Polish noble, politely declined and then vomited into a potted fern on the way out. The mould obsession coincided with another of Ivan's strange beliefs, that different types of palace mould held different emotional properties. The pale yellow splotches on the lower walls were said to calm the heart. Darker green smears near the ceiling. Good for clarity, he claimed. Blue fuzz in the corners, which he named Tsarina's beard, allegedly helped with decision-making. He kept a mould diary. Each day he described his favourite patches, how they grew, how they tasted, and how they made him feel. One entry reads, "Corner stain beneath the western mirror, a melancholy joy like snowfall on empty roads." Another, more ominously, "The one near the fireplace is jealous. I feel its heat in my thoughts." By modern standards, this veers from eccentric into delusional. Scholars still debate whether Ivan suffered from a mental illness, perhaps a form of schizophrenia or obsessive-compulsive disorder. But in the 17th century, the court simply called it divine insight, or at worst, the Tsar's winter moods. His wife, Praskovia, largely kept her distance. When asked why she never visited her husband's chambers, she replied, "Because I already know what mould tastes like, thank you." Surprisingly, Ivan's condition improved slightly during these years. Whether by placebo, coincidence, or something strange in the spores, his tremors reduced, his sleep returned, and he was able to attend public functions again, provided no one mentioned cleaning products. One historian notes that Ivan's wall mould may have contained strains of penicillium, which can indeed have antimicrobial properties, a fortunate accident, or the world's least appetizing breakthrough in medical history. Regardless, Ivan's death in 1696 ended the mould era. Peter the Great, ever the reformer, ordered the palace fumigated. Every inch was scrubbed, painted, and sterilised. Ivan's rooms were sealed off and eventually repurposed as storage space for official portraits. The diary vanished. The walls were bleached. History exhaled, but not entirely. In 1954, during a routine restoration of the Kremlin's lesser wings, workers uncovered a sealed chamber lined with ornate tiling and a strange earthy odour. Inside was a shelf of crystal jars, empty but still labelled in spidery Cyrillic, for clarity, for calm, for iron thoughts. Nearby lay a disintegrating spoon fused with grey film. The walls were, of course, covered in mould. A sample was taken and examined. The strain? A unique hybrid of common household fungi and something unclassified. Dense, with oddly spiralled growth patterns. One scientist reportedly passed out after spending too long in the room. He claimed he heard whispering in the walls. Is it true? Hard to say. The chamber was resealed. The report was quietly archived. And the mould? Still there, perhaps, waiting for a tongue bold enough to try again. So, while the pharaohs burned their nose hairs to breathe cleanly, Ivan V simply ate his mildew and called it medicine. Both acts, in their way, were attempts to control the unseen forces of the body, the little things we can't quite understand but feel in our bones. And maybe, just maybe, a little mould never hurt anyone, unless they licked the paint. Among the many curious ways monarchs insisted on being observed, perhaps none blur the lines between power and absurdity quite like the royal bathroom ritual. You might think a king or queen's most private moments were sacred, shielded by thick walls and loyal guards. But in fact, some rulers treated their time on the toilet as a kind of performance, a ritual of prestige, a weirdly aromatic demonstration of divine status. Let's take a short and deeply uncomfortable trip to the court of France once again, this time to the reign of Louis XIV, the Sun King, whose palace at Versailles dazzled Europe with its opulence. Gilded mirrors, endless gardens, choreographed fountains, and tucked away from the grand salons, a whole ecosystem of toilets. Or rather, something slightly less dignified. While Versailles had a handful of permanent commodes, the majority of the royal household relied on what were known as chaises à l'anglaise, wooden boxes with a padded seat, porcelain chamber pot beneath, and occasionally a velvet curtain for modesty. But for the king himself, even nature's call had a protocol. Louis XIV famously held his morning petit lever, the little rising, which was essentially a public waking ceremony involving dozens of nobles. His dressing, his prayers, even his first bowel movement of the day, all could be witnessed by those with proper rank. This wasn't accidental. The ritual was designed to reinforce the monarch's absolute control, even over his own body. To be granted the right to observe him relieving himself was a political privilege, a sign that you were trusted, or, at the very least, tolerated. Imagine it, a dozen courtiers standing in brocade-lined silence, while the king sits upon a gold-trimmed commode, leafs through correspondence, and occasionally glances up to offer dry remarks about military budgets or hunting schedules. And nobody flinches. This was power in its most basic biological form. The chamber pot was then whisked away by the royal Groom of the Stool, an actual job title. In England, this position was one of high esteem, often held by aristocrats who used the role to gain insider access to the monarch's secrets, moods, and diet-based ailments. The groom was responsible for ensuring the king's commode was clean, warm, and well stocked with fine linen napkins. Yes, linen. Soft, reusable, and, if rumours are true, occasionally embroidered with royal crests. One particularly enthusiastic groom, Sir William Compton under Henry VIII, gained immense influence simply by knowing when the king had an upset stomach. He would use this knowledge to schedule or delay audiences for his allies. In other words, he turned Tudor indigestion into political currency. But France and England weren't alone in this. The Habsburg court in Austria had its own take. A porcelain throne with a velvet seat and golden handles, placed not in a private chamber, but often adjacent to meeting rooms. Emperor Joseph II believed in efficiency, and would sometimes dictate policy while, well, dictating something else. His ministers, trained in court etiquette, learned never to break eye contact. One unfortunate ambassador reportedly turned pale and fainted during an especially long strategy session. He was reassigned to a quieter post in Transylvania, perhaps to recover. In Russia, Catherine the Great had her own system. She commissioned several travelling commodes disguised as ordinary chairs, crafted by the imperial cabinet maker himself. These stealthy toilets followed her throughout the Winter Palace, always nearby. She was known to conduct conversations while using them, claiming that truth flows easier when the body is unburdened. Whether anyone dared argue with her mid-process is lost to history. Even in China, the Qing dynasty emperors had imperial rest stools, guarded by eunuchs, who managed elaborate disposal systems, ensuring the emperor's waste was handled with dignity. It was believed that royal bodily matter could be targeted by sorcerers, so elaborate precautions were taken to destroy or hide it. Fire pits, sealed jars, secret tunnels beneath the Forbidden City. Some monarchs went further still. King James I of England reportedly kept a detailed record of his bowel movements, noting colour, consistency, and frequency. One surviving journal entry includes a cheerful line: "This morning's work was long, smooth, and pleasing, praise be to God." Historians still debate whether this was medical documentation or just early blogging. The bizarre public nature of these habits wasn't only about status. In many cases, it was rooted in a belief that a monarch's health was a matter of state. Observing the ruler's physical condition, even at their most vulnerable, was considered part of maintaining the body politic. If the king's digestion failed, it might be seen as a metaphor for national decay. So yes, courtiers tracked bowel movements with the same intensity as military campaigns. This tradition, oddly enough, trickled down into noble culture. Aristocrats in certain courts began holding their own bathroom salons, where they would conduct casual chats while using portable commodes. The French even developed a niche genre of furniture, the chaise percée, or pierced chair, many of which doubled as writing desks or tea tables. Because why separate tasks when you can multitask like royalty? There's one particularly unsettling case from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. King Augustus II, known as the Strong, had such chronic constipation that he required multiple attendants to help position him on the royal toilet. His throne, built from oak and brass, included levers and pulleys. One aide reportedly developed a permanent limp from a poorly timed lifting session. Even stranger was Augustus's belief that his release could signal divine favour. Before important decisions, he would delay his morning ritual until receiving a sign, usually a falcon cry or a specific cloud shape, believing that this synchronization would clear his mind and his realm alike. Of course, not all royal bathroom habits were so public. Queen Victoria, for instance, had a deep horror of bodily functions. Her staff was forbidden to speak of them in her presence, and her personal commode was kept behind a 3-panel screen surrounded by lavender sachets. Her chambermaids changed the linens hourly, even if unused. To Victoria, discretion was not just preferred, it was mandatory. Contrast that with King Charles II, who was so unfazed by the process that he'd often read aloud from bawdy plays while on the toilet. His private physician once joked that he'd heard more Shakespeare in the bathroom than in the Globe Theatre. Then there's the odd case of Emperor Norton I, as self-proclaimed Emperor of the United States and Protector of Mexico, who carried his own portable toilet seat, embroidered with stars. He believed the act of sitting on any non-royal seat would erase his titles. Every public facility he used he declared an imperial outpost. And the strangest fringe theory. Some scholars believe Napoleon Bonaparte had his personal latrine seat packed in, with his campaign gear during the march to Russia. A padded leather-lined folding chair with a copper bowl It was allegedly carried by a man nicknamed Chamberlain of the Night Wind. While the chair itself has never been found, sketches appear in the margins of one soldier's journal, labelled only "The Emperor's Thunderbox." All of these tales, absurd, awkward, astonishing, serve a common theme. The body, even in its most private functions, was part of the theatre of monarchy. Rulers didn't just rule by decree, they ruled by example, even if that example involved gold-plated chamber pots and formal defecation schedules. Today we take privacy for granted, locked doors, ventilation fans, a phone in one hand. But for centuries, relieving oneself was yet another stage where power played its part. And somewhere, in the echoing halls of abandoned palaces, you can almost hear the faint squeak of a velvet stool being drawn forward, the rustle of brocade robes, and the whispered murmur of a courtier pretending not to notice, because even kings must sit, and some never quite stood alone. If you thought royal pets were all golden retrievers and pampered spaniels lounging on silk cushions, think again. Because tonight we're diving deep into the most stomach-churning, eyebrow-raising chapter yet. A royal who kept a pet tapeworm and gave it a name. Meet King Charles XI of Sweden. Reigning during the late 17th century, Charles was known for his stern demeanour, strict financial reforms and, yes, his peculiar relationship with his own digestive intruder. He suffered from chronic intestinal issues, which modern scholars suspect were symptoms of a tapeworm infection. Most people would have called a doctor. Charles, on the other hand, embraced his parasitic companion like an old friend. He named it George. Now George wasn't visible, not at first. Tapeworms reside deep in the intestines, latching onto the host and growing silently, sometimes reaching lengths of up to 30 feet. But Charles believed he could feel George's movements. He described them as a wriggling presence, or an inner stir that flared up after heavy meals. He became convinced George had moods. Mornings were generally calm. After roasted goose, agitated. After cherries and cream, positively chipper. It started as a joke. Court physicians, puzzled by Charles's persistent complaints, performed rudimentary examinations and prescribed the usual medieval remedies: ground pumpkin seeds, wine infusions, garlic poultices. Nothing worked. Then one day, after a particularly long episode of abdominal discomfort, Charles reportedly leaned back in his chair, clutched his belly and announced, "George does not care for eel." From then on, George became a fixture at court. Not literally, though there's an unfortunate story coming, but conversationally. Charles would refer to him during meals, claiming certain dishes would upset George. Visiting dignitaries were warned to avoid serving strong spices at diplomatic dinners for fear of angering the royal pet. And no one dared laugh. Well, almost no one. A French ambassador once chuckled at the mention of George during a state luncheon. Charles responded by cancelling all further meetings with the envoy and sending him home with a jar of laxatives. The message was clear: don't insult the worm. But the obsession only deepened. Charles began journaling George's behaviour. He tracked his moods, his wakefulness, even his reaction to poetry. Yes, poetry. The king would sometimes read aloud from Swedish epics while resting on a chaise, claiming George twitched more vigorously during passages of battle, and less during romance. One eerie line from his notes reads, "George thrashed during the duel scene today. I suspect he detests injustice." He even began crafting a schedule around his worm's rhythms. Audiences were delayed if George was restless. Entire days of governance were shaped by what Charles described as intestinal diplomacy. One court physician, desperate for answers, suggested that the king undergo a purge, a violently effective and entirely disgusting procedure involving strong herbal enemas designed to expel the parasite. Charles refused. He insisted George was not the cause of his discomfort, but rather a companion enduring it with him. "We suffer together," he said, reportedly with tears in his eyes. A fringe story tells of a gilded plaque in Charles's personal chamber, engraved with the phrase, "I am never alone." Many assumed it was a reference to God. Those who knew better weren't so sure. But the real turn came years later, when Charles experienced a dramatic release. After a week of nausea and restlessness, he suddenly collapsed in his chamber, only to recover hours later with a curious sense of peace. His physicians rushed to examine him and discovered, well, George, or rather, the physical evidence of George's final exit. The tapeworm, now dead, was reportedly over 20 feet long and still partly intact. The king, rather than expressing horror or relief, wept openly. He ordered the remains preserved in a jar of alcohol and stored in the royal apothecary. The label? George, faithful companion, 1673 to 1692. Now, if you're wondering what became of that jar, you're not alone. The Royal Archives mention it sporadically for about 50 years, then it vanishes. Some say it was buried in a royal garden under a lilac tree. Others claim a servant stole it to sell to an Amsterdam collector. A few even suggest it was accidentally consumed by a misinformed palace cat. No one knows for sure. And Charles? He lived several more years, quieter and more withdrawn. He rarely spoke of George again. But at one banquet near the end of his life, when served eel in saffron broth, he reportedly smiled and murmured, he wouldn't have liked this one bit. But Charles XI wasn't the only monarch with unconventional taste in pets. Tsar Peter III of Russia had a pet rat, whom he dressed in miniature soldier uniforms and kept in a small wooden barracks near his desk. When the rat allegedly defected, read escaped and chewed through a curtain, Peter staged a full military trial, found him guilty of treason, and hanged him from a tiny noose. This, mind you, was a man expected to modernise the Russian Empire. Queen Juana of Castile, also known as Joanna the Mad, famously travelled with the coffin of her deceased husband, Philip the Handsome, refusing to part with it for years. She believed he would someday rise again, and reportedly spoke to the body nightly, offering it food and playing him music. Whether driven by grief, delusion, or a genuine belief in resurrection, Juana's attachment blurs the line between devotion and madness. Even King George III of England, long before his well-documented mental decline, kept a menagerie that included a talking parrot, a blind badger, and a tortoise he named Sir Slow. The tortoise was fed cakes soaked in brandy, and George believed it understood court gossip. When Sir Slow stopped eating, the king reportedly ordered a day of mourning. But Charles XI's relationship with George stands out because it wasn't just eccentric, it was intimate. There's something oddly touching, even tragic, about a monarch forging companionship with a parasite. Perhaps it was loneliness, perhaps the crushing burden of rule, or maybe, as one modern historian suggests, it was simply the king's way of externalizing the parts of himself he couldn't control. George became more than a worm. He was a metaphor, a confidant, a shadow self living just beneath the surface, literally. And so, tucked in a forgotten corner of royal history, somewhere between battle plans and tax reforms, lives a wriggling footnote named George. He didn't sign treaties or lead armies, but he certainly left a mark, mostly gastrointestinal. And maybe, just maybe, that's the most disturbingly human royal habit of all, finding companionship in the most unexpected and unwelcome places. When stepping into a royal court, you expect perfume. Fragrant clouds of rose oil, ambergris, lavender, myrrh, kings and queens swaddled in scented silks. But what happens when those luxurious scents become deadly? When the very fragrance meant to signal status and allure turns traitorous, sinking into skin and bloodstreams, rotting flesh in secret? For several members of Europe's royal elite, their chosen perfumes didn't just fail to protect them, they poisoned them from the inside out. Let's uncork the most fragrant vial of all with Queen Elizabeth I of England. Known as the Virgin Queen, she cultivated an image of ethereal radiance, glowing white skin, elaborate ruffled collars, and of course her signature scent, a heady blend of rosewater, lavender, musk, and white lead. Yes, white lead, because in Elizabeth's time, facial powders were thick, deadly, and disturbingly fragrant. Her go-to mixture was called Venetian ceruse, a white paste made of vinegar and lead that masked blemishes, smoothed skin, and, over time, devoured it. Combine that with perfumes laced with mercury compounds, and you've got a woman essentially embalming herself while alive. Her skin began to thin, hairline receded, teeth blackened. But she never appeared in public without the full mask. She wasn't alone. The Elizabethan court was a garden of toxic flowers. Men and women alike drenched themselves in perfumes spiked with heavy metals and animal musk, secretion from the scent glands of deer, civets, or beavers. These ingredients made the scent stick, but also caused rashes, respiratory problems, and in more than one case permanent neurological damage. The motto seemed to be smell divine, die slowly, But this trend didn't die with the Tudors. Jump forward a century to France, where the court of Louis XIV, grandson of the aforementioned scream-prone Sun King, earned the nickname La Cour Parfumée, or the Perfumed Court. His palace reeked in the most expensive way possible. Floors were scrubbed with rosewater, fountains sprayed scented alcohol, even the dogs wore cologne. Louis XV himself commissioned over 60 different scents for different moods and times of day. Morning required neroli and bergamot, afternoon demanded sandalwood and verbena, evening, ambergris, musk, and what some scholars believe was tincture of benzoin, a resin used for incense but known to cause dizziness in confined spaces. To live in Versailles during this time was to choke on sweetness. Courtiers developed headaches, vertigo, and perfume fatigue, a documented condition where the olfactory system simply shuts down from overexposure. Some nobles walked with scented kerchiefs clutched permanently under their noses, not to protect from stench, but from overload. One duchess fainted during a ball after dancing beside a nobleman soaked in clove and jasmine. She later claimed, "His scent climbed into my brain and kicked over my thoughts." Doctors bled her to restore balance. It didn't help. The irony? Perfume became popular not just for allure but to mask decay. Hygiene was still largely decorative. Most people bathed only occasionally. Scent became a substitute for soap, a costume for cleanliness. Unfortunately, those scents were often composed of volatile chemicals, especially in the black market perfumes that swirled through the court, which brings us to the most infamous olfactory offender, the case of Maria Anna of Bavaria, Electress of Saxony. Maria Anna, cousin to multiple royal houses, was obsessed with perfume to the point of obsession. Her chambers were lined with cabinets of tiny glass bottles, hundreds of them, each marked with cryptic initials and date codes. She wore layers of scent, sometimes changing them hourly. And one summer, after a new blend arrived from Venice, an exotic compound of civet, frankincense, and a mysterious amber oil, her skin began to blister. She dismissed it as a heat rash. Then her eyes grew inflamed. Her fingernails loosened. Her hair thinned so dramatically that wigs became mandatory. Still, she persisted, believing the scent enhanced her presence. One ambassador wrote, "Her arrival precedes her by several minutes." Eventually she collapsed during a court ceremony. Physicians swarmed, then recoiled. The smell rising from her body was overpowering. She died weeks later, her skin patchy, her organs inflamed. The Venetian blend was quietly confiscated and analysed by chemists, who discovered traces of arsenic used as a fixative. Whether it was deliberate assassination or just reckless apothecary alchemy remains a mystery. Historians still argue whether she was poisoned by design. Arsenic, after all, has a long history in royal intrigue, but it's equally possible that her blend was simply a chemical time bomb. In a court where knowledge of scent chemistry lagged far behind ambition, perfume was playing Russian roulette in crystal bottles. Even the famed Catherine de' Medici, Queen Consort of France, had her own rumoured toxic signature. She brought perfume culture from Italy, commissioning secret blends from her personal apothecary, René Le Florentin. One of their most popular creations was a scent called Aqua Tofana, a name later attached to one of history's deadliest poisons. Though not definitively linked, the whispers suggest some of Catherine's gifts to rivals were less than aromatic. But none of these stories top the strange lingering tale of Duke Leopold of Lorraine. Leopold, ruling a quiet duchy tucked between France and Germany, developed a fascination with a specific scent. Iris root steeped in goat's milk, strained through silk and blended with civet. He claimed it calmed his blood lightning, which scholars believe referred to epileptic fits. He ordered servants to spray his rooms daily. After several years, mould began creeping up his palace walls, and guests noticed their vision blurred inside the main parlour. One nobleman's nose bled for 3 days after an extended chess match with the Duke. After Leopold's death, his physician catalogued over 400 unique perfume recipes stored in corked scrolls, including one labelled, "For Loyalty with Bitterness." Modern analysis of a surviving vial revealed camphor, absinthe, sulphur, and trace amounts of lead. Essentially, a scent that could summon loyalty from anyone, by knocking them unconscious. Fast forward again to Victorian England, where the industrial age introduced synthetic perfumes. No longer dependent on natural musk or flower oils, perfumers began experimenting with coal tar derivatives and aldehydes. Cheap, powerful and dizzyingly aromatic. Queen Victoria herself was known to wear a lily-of-the-valley scent that included benzaldehyde, which today is regulated for its toxicity. Her staff was instructed to apply it to her pillows, gloves, and even under her mourning veils. There's one fringe account of a young chambermaid who, after handling the Queen's gloves, developed vision ghosts and hallucinated bees for 3 days. She was dismissed as hysterical. Others began reporting headaches and memory loss, but the Queen's scent remained unchanged. What's chilling is how often perfume intersected with medicine. Many blends were touted as cures for melancholy or protection against plague. Doctors prescribed inhalation of clove oil and myrrh during outbreaks, but some of these tonics contained narcotics, corrosives, or worse. In one case, a Danish prince accidentally ingested a perfume designed to be worn, not drunk, and spent a week deliriously reciting the Psalms backwards. In hindsight, the line between beauty and biohazard was perilously thin. Today, we regulate fragrance ingredients, test them rigorously, and mostly understand what we're applying. But in royal courts, perfume was a gamble. Each vial a mystery, each dab a risk. And for many, the last thing they ever smelled was their own undoing. So next time you spray a little cologne before a big night out, be grateful your scent doesn't include powdered arsenic, goat milk, or musk scraped from a dead beaver's glands. Unless, of course, you're aiming for that authentic royal flair, because once upon a time smelling like a king could kill you like one too. When we think of Napoleon Bonaparte, we often picture the general in his bicorn hat, hand tucked inside his jacket, charging through Europe with cannon smoke in his wake. But behind the myths of military genius and the complicated ego was a man driven by sentiment. So much so that he once kept a human hair sandwich. Not metaphorically, not figuratively. A literal sandwich, carefully wrapped, containing a lock of hair. His most treasured snack. Not quite. But as you'll see, it was disturbingly close. Let's unpack this with care, because this story begins not on the battlefield, but in Napoleon's heart. Napoleon was deeply infatuated with Josephine de Beauharnais, a widow 6 years his senior with a penchant for roses and scandal. Their romance was a whirlwind of passionate letters, obsessive declarations and emotional turbulence. While he was campaigning across Europe, he would write to her daily, pages filled with desperate longing, petty jealousy, and occasionally veiled threats. He demanded tokens, used gloves, handkerchiefs, and most intimately her hair. Josephine obliged. Locks of her dark curls were snipped and sent, often perfumed and bound with silk ribbon. Napoleon stored them in tiny golden lockets, glass vials, and once, according to the personal memoir of his valet, in a wax-sealed pouch that he placed inside a hollowed-out roll. The valet, whose job included unpacking the emperor's travel baggage, claimed he found the hair roll wrapped in parchment labelled Sustenance of the Heart. Napoleon allegedly ate around it, preserving the hair centre like a sacred pit inside a fruit. Now, whether this particular sandwich was intended for consumption or simply transport remains hotly debated. Some historians insist it was merely a hiding place. Others, more dramatically, believe Napoleon may have once bitten into a keepsake roll during a fit of nostalgia, only to realise mid-chew he'd encountered a familiar follicle. Either way, it's a story that lingers like overripe cheese. Josephine wasn't the only one whose hair made it into Napoleon's private museum. He also kept locks from his mother, his sister Pauline, and even a few officers he admired. One particularly grim sample came from Marshal Lannes, who died in battle. Napoleon reportedly clipped a piece himself, sobbing at the bedside before folding it into a pastry crust so it would travel safely. Hair to Napoleon was not just a memento, it was an artifact of the soul. He believed that a person's essence lived in their strands, and that to possess them was to retain a fragment of their power, memory, or love. In some of his more poetic letters, he referred to hair as the silk of memory, and once told Josephine, "Your curls are my compass when the world grows stormy." And yet, his obsession didn't end there. After his exile to Elba, Napoleon continued the ritual. Isolated, stripped of power and surrounded by loyalists and spies alike, he found comfort in his hair reliquary. Visitors noted that he often opened a small leather box and gazed silently at its contents. When pressed, he'd smile and say, "They remind me of the ones I've lost, and those I still command." One unsettling tale claims he asked a maid to cut a lock from her own head after she reminded him of Josephine. She refused. The next day she was dismissed. Of course, Napoleon wasn't alone in this morbid practice. Hair collecting was common in the 18th and 19th centuries, especially among the upper classes. Mourning jewellery often featured locks braided into rings or pendants. Lovers exchanged them in lieu of portraits. Parents kept clippings from their children's first haircuts. It was sentimental, but Napoleon took sentimentality to levels usually reserved for poetry and mild psychosis. Even after his death, the obsession continued. When Napoleon died in 1821 on the island of St. Helena, multiple people snuck into the room to snip a final souvenir. Locks from his head were distributed among friends, generals, and even auctioned to strangers. One particularly large sample, allegedly snipped by his valet, was later tested in the 20th century and found to contain elevated levels of arsenic. This discovery spawned a new theory, that Napoleon was slowly poisoned during his exile, and that the hair preserved the evidence. Historians still debate the cause of his death. Was it stomach cancer, arsenic, a combination of bad wallpaper and worse politics? Regardless, it's fitting that the most telling clue would be hidden in a single strand. But the story of hair sandwiches doesn't end with Napoleon. No. Royalty across the centuries shared his fascination with follicular trophies. Queen Victoria, for instance, kept a locket of Prince Albert's hair around her neck until the day she died. Her mourning attire always included a hidden compartment containing part of his beard. She also had a ring made from her daughter's first curls, which she wore during particularly stressful state meetings. For her, the hair was grounding, an emotional anchor in a sea of political turbulence. And then there's the Habsburgs. Emperor Franz Joseph reportedly kept a sample of Empress Elizabeth's hair, braided and sealed, inside a tiny frame beneath his writing desk. Whenever he was faced with difficult decisions, he'd slide open the compartment and touch it with his fingertips. He claimed it brought clarity. His ministers claimed it made him late. Even in Eastern traditions, hair was revered. Mughal emperors often kept moustache clippings from their fathers and grandfathers, preserved in carved ivory boxes and passed down like relics. One surviving piece is now on display in a museum in Lahore, labelled simply the Whispered Filament. But no monarch matched Napoleon's level of intimate obsession. His personal chambers often smelled faintly of camphor and lavender, the preservatives used to store his hair tokens. On Elba, he commissioned a craftsman to build a wooden cabinet with 30 drawers, each sized for a locket, bundle, or ribbon-bound sample. Some were labelled in code, others bore initials. One simply read, Jay's Breath. And yet, for all his conquests, brilliance, and political manipulation, Napoleon's most tender legacy might be this: a man surrounded by maps and muskets, quietly treasuring the memory of his beloved, not in painting or statue, but in a lock of her hair, hidden inside a roll of bread. It's an image both touching and profoundly weird, a reminder that even history's titans were prone to loneliness, nostalgia, and deeply unsettling snack habits. And if someday, while leafing through a dusty antique shop, you find a miniature sandwich sealed in wax with a single hair inside and a faded note that reads for memory, maybe don't take a bite. The sound that haunted the marble halls wasn't a footstep or a door creak, it was a whisper, or perhaps more accurately, the echo of a whisper, the sort that seems to linger a beat too long, just after the speaker has gone silent. In the royal palaces of Europe, mirrors didn't just reflect, they listened. And in at least one case they even replied. Our next descent into regal weirdness leads us into the reflective world of monarchs who surrounded themselves with mirror rooms and silence. Not out of vanity, but as part of strange spiritual practices. Welcome to the realm of echo whispers and divine conversations. One of the strangest examples comes from Empress Elizabeth of Austria, also known as Sisi. Often remembered for her beauty and tragic life, Sisi had an equally enigmatic habit. She created rooms of total reflection. No, not meditation chambers. Literal rooms covered from floor to ceiling with polished mirrors. These were not the elegant decorative panels you'd find in Versailles. These were obsessively positioned glass sheets, placed so precisely that her own reflection would multiply into infinite selves. One courtier called it a house of 1,000 Sisis. And it wasn't built for admiration. It was constructed to receive messages. Sisi believed the mirrored room could channel spiritual voices. She would sit in silence, alone, for hours, eyes half closed, listening not to the reflections but to the space between them, to the echoes. She called it whisper light. Whether it was seance, self-hypnosis, or something she concocted entirely, no one could say. But she was convinced that these mirrored chambers held voices from beyond, some divine, others ancestral. She claimed her deceased son, Rudolf, spoke to her through one particular pane. Only in moonlight. Only when she sat at the precise angle. She marked the floor with a small star and refused to let anyone clean that section, afraid the echo might be swept away. One maid disobeyed, and was swiftly reassigned to the laundry wing in Budapest. Cece wasn't alone in her reflective obsession. Louis II of Bavaria, cousin to Empress Elizabeth and well known for his eccentricity, built a mirrored retreat deep in the Alps. The reflection room, as he called it, was reachable only by boat and a short forest path. Inside, hundreds of concave mirrors, polished to unnatural clarity, each one facing another. The acoustics were so precise that a single whisper would bounce for several seconds, travelling in a spiral through the chamber. Louis used it to hold imaginary councils. He would pace the room, speaking to his reflection, posing questions to the echoes. Should he raise taxes, build another opera house, invite Wagner for dinner again? The answers came not in voices, but in what he called mirror logic, a flash of realization after watching his own gaze fracture across a dozen panes. The truth, he once wrote, is not in the face, but in the failure of the face to remain one. Yes, he wrote that. In a gold-embossed diary now stored in the Bavarian State Library, Louis's behaviour grew increasingly erratic. He ordered servants to dress in reverse, shirts backwards, hats inside out, believing it would confuse the watchers in the glass. One footman claimed he caught the king mid-conversation with a mirror, asking it to remember a truth too terrible to speak aloud. Eventually his ministers declared him insane and removed him from power. Days later, he died under mysterious circumstances in a lake. His mirrored room was dismantled, but legend has it, a single pane remained hidden in a monastery attic, and that it still sings in winter when no one is watching. Across the sea in England, Queen Caroline of Ansbach, wife of George II, kept a chamber lined not with mirrors, but with silver-tinted glass imported from Venice. The chamber was circular, entirely enclosed, with a single velvet cushion in the centre. She called it her listening room. Caroline was fascinated by acoustics. She believed certain architectural shapes could amplify thoughts, not voices, but internal dialogue. She would sit in the centre of the room and murmur questions to herself, then wait for the curved walls to answer. Occasionally she heard something, a name, a single word. Once the phrase "end of spring" repeated twice. She fell ill the following March and never recovered. Her diary includes sketches of sound paths, lines drawn from mouth to mirror to ear. She also recorded temperature, moon phase, and atmospheric pressure for each session. A scientist ahead of her time, or something far stranger. Of course, not all reflective rituals were silent. In the palace of the Shah Abbas, the first of Persia, a chamber called the Hall of Whispers was built with gemstone-encrusted mirrors and curved ceilings. Legend claimed that a secret uttered in one corner would travel through the geometry of the space and reach only one listener across the room, chosen by fate. The Shah used it for matters of state, speaking secrets into the walls to test his advisors. If the chosen one heard and responded, they were rewarded. If someone else answered, well, let's just say they were never heard from again. The chamber exists today in Isfahan, renovated and rebranded, of course, but guides still warn visitors not to whisper anything they wouldn't want answered. Then there's the curious case of Tsar Alexander I of Russia, who reportedly commissioned a mirrored writing desk, its surface so polished that his own reflection would watch him as he wrote. He claimed it kept him honest. If his hand hesitated or strayed, the reflection would scold him with the eyes. His letters became increasingly cryptic, sentences half-finished, diagrams of his face interspersed with notes about military positions. Some believe he was engaged in a battle of wills with himself. Others think he was practicing a form of mirrored prophecy, reading not the words he wrote, but the ones he saw in reverse. There's even a surviving fragment where he scribbles, "It's not what the mirror shows, but what it refuses to reflect." Chilling words from a man who may or may not have faked his own death. Mirror superstition goes far back. In ancient Rome, breaking a mirror was believed to fracture the soul. The Persians thought mirrors captured the breath of truth. In imperial China, emperors had truth mirrors, polished daily, convinced that treason could be glimpsed in a courtier's reflection. But no royal embraced reflective rituals quite like Sultan Selim III of the Ottoman Empire. Selim, a poet and music lover, built a mirror room shaped like a music box, where each wall pane was tuned to vibrate with specific pitches. He played the ney, a traditional reed flute, inside the chamber, believing the mirrors would remember his melodies. After each performance, he would ask the walls a question. Then he'd play again and listen for changes. He wrote that one mirror refused his minor scale, and another wept when touched with longing. Whether he was synesthetic or slipping into madness is unclear, but when he was deposed, his successor ordered the mirror room dismantled. The fragments were scattered, but musicians in Istanbul still whisper about a singing shard hidden in a private collection. Modern psychologists might call these rituals projection, auditory hallucination, or sensory feedback loops. But for the royals who practiced them, these chambers weren't oddities. They were sanctuaries, portals, confession booths where no priest sat, only a silent face with your eyes. Today, we treat mirrors as tools. We check our hair, we swipe at smudges, we laugh at our own expressions. But imagine being surrounded by hundreds, thousands of reflections, all staring back, all slightly off, none quite the same. Imagine sitting alone, speaking into a room that throws your voice back at you, distorted and slow. Maybe it's no wonder the echoes began to answer, and maybe, somewhere in a forgotten palace, a cracked mirror still listens, still waits, still remembers the secrets once whispered to it in candlelight. Of all the bizarre and disturbing royal habits scattered throughout history, none quite matches the unsettling intimacy of monarchs who refuse to let go of the dead, not in grief, not in memory, and in some extreme cases, not even physically. Because tucked in the vaulted closets of aristocracy are stories of mummified lovers, decaying darlings, and royal companions who stayed long past their expiration date. Let's begin with the lonely emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Ferdinand II of Tyrol. Known more for his obsessions than his politics, Ferdinand ruled in the 16th century and surrounded himself with oddities, taxidermied unicorns, mechanical songbirds, and automaton angels. But none of these curiosities raised quite as many eyebrows as his private tomb chamber collection. After the death of his mistress, a young noblewoman named Anna Caterina Gonzaga, Ferdinand commissioned her embalming, and not just a typical interment. He had her preserved, clothed in her finest silks, adorned with jewellery, and installed upright in a private room adjacent to his study. There, he would visit her regularly, read to her, hold her hand. On rare occasions, according to the more gossipy memoirs of visiting nobles, he would ask her opinion, then respond to her silence with, "You've always been so wise." Servants were forbidden to speak of these encounters, but some did. One described the air in the room as thick with perfumes and stillness. Another claimed the body was regularly brushed and dusted, as though still expecting guests. The bizarre shrine remained intact until Ferdinand's death, when horrified relatives finally ordered the mummified lover quietly reburied, stripped of jewels, and labelled anonymously in the crypt's back corner. Her original casket, covered in red velvet and glass panels, was dismantled and repurposed as a reliquary stand. But this is only one of many tales. Perhaps the most famous case of necrotic romance comes from Spain, specifically Queen Juana of Castile, better known by her unfortunate moniker Juana la Loca, or Joanna the Mad. Juana was married to Philip the Handsome, a Burgundian prince whose looks, charm and royal charisma captivated her to the point of obsession. Their marriage was passionate and volatile, marked by fierce love and legendary jealousy. Juana reportedly assaulted several women she suspected of flirting with her husband, pulling hair, tearing gowns, and in one case locking a rival in a wine cellar for a full day. But when Philip died suddenly in 1506, likely from typhoid, Juana unravelled completely. She refused to bury the body. Instead, she had it embalmed and placed in an elaborate coffin, which she insisted accompany her wherever she went. For months she travelled through the Castilian countryside with the corpse in tow, opening the casket at intervals to confirm he was resting peacefully. She banned women from approaching the coffin, claiming Philip would be offended by their scent. At night, she sometimes slept beside it. Torches burned around the casket, and clergy were forced to chant nightly prayers. One priest claimed she spoke to the corpse as though he answered, laughing quietly, weeping loudly and whispering, Only I can warm your bones." Eventually her father, Ferdinand II of Aragon, intervened. Juana was declared mentally unfit and confined to the royal convent of Santa Clara for the rest of her life. But even there she continued speaking to Philip's ghost, insisting his spirit visited her nightly. When she died in 1555, her coffin was finally placed beside his. Some historians argue Juana suffered from schizophrenia, others believe she was a victim of political suppression. But whatever the diagnosis, her inability, or refusal, to let go of her husband's physical presence stands as one of the most haunting examples of romantic devotion turned morbid. Not to be outdone, France had its own mummified secret. King Charles VI, known as Charles the Mad, allegedly developed a delusion late in life that his deceased brother, Louis I of Orléans, was still alive, just very, very quiet. After Louis's brutal assassination in 1407, Charles began requesting his presence at court, setting places for him at feasts, and, according to court gossip, once had his corpse exhumed and propped in a private gallery. No formal record confirms this last claim, but multiple nobles referenced a silent guest in their letters, always seated in shadow, always watched over by veiled guards. Whether it was truly Louis's body or a mannequin dressed in his robes is unknown, but either way, Charles appeared soothed by its presence. His doctors said nothing, his ministers whispered, and France limped along, led by a king who dined with the dead. One might think such habits were confined to the long-ago days of monarchs driven mad by power and isolation. But the 19th century delivered its own version in Ludwig I of Bavaria. After the death of his mistress, Lola Montez, a dancer and self-styled Spanish noblewoman, Ludwig reportedly kept a wax effigy of her, lifelike and intricately detailed, in his private chambers. He would bring her meals, play music, and even write letters from her to himself. It became such a scandal that court officials forced him to abdicate. And then there's the strange tale of Princess Paulina Bonaparte, Napoleon's favourite sister. Paulina was famously flamboyant, posing nude for sculptures, hosting scandalous parties, and draping herself in pearls while bathing in milk. But when her lover, a Corsican nobleman named Jules de Canouville, died in battle, she was inconsolable. She claimed his spirit remained with her and kept a portion of his cremated remains in a ring. At night, she would press it to her lips and speak to it in whispers. A servant once reported seeing her place the ring in a wine goblet and drink from it solemnly, claiming it kept his memory alive in her veins. It's not clear whether the ashes were real, but the intensity of her devotion, or theatricality, made Paulina's mourning legend among Bonaparte circles. These macabre acts weren't entirely taboo in certain royal contexts. In some traditions, keeping remains was part of reverence. Russian tsars displayed the hands of saints. French kings kissed bones during coronations. But these were sacred relics, ritual objects. The mummified lovers, embalmed mistresses and whispering effigies existed outside of sanctioned reverence. They were private altars, emotional escape pods, and sometimes acts of resistance against the finality of death. Modern historians look back with a blend of horror and empathy. After all, who among us hasn't longed for one more moment, one more conversation, one more touch from someone gone? Royals, for all their power, were often more isolated than we can imagine, surrounded by sycophants, ruled by schedules, burdened by expectations. Grief had no place at court, so they carved out little corners for it, padded with velvet, perfumed with lilies, locked behind gilded doors. Today those rooms are mostly gone, repurposed, renovated, forgotten. But every so often a dusty inventory list surfaces, a coffin hidden in a cupboard, a wax figure listed as library statue, a lock of hair sealed in crystal, labelled with nothing but a date and a heart. And maybe, just maybe, someone still kneels before it, whispering softly, "You've always been so wise." In the gilded courts of 18th century Europe, love letters weren't just scribbled in ink, they were scented, sealed, sometimes even smuggled, and in one truly peculiar case, they were soaked in the literal sweat of a king. The story belongs to Queen Maria Carolina of Naples and her husband Ferdinand IV, two names that don't often jump out from the pages of royal history. But within the quiet corridors of the Neapolitan court, Maria Carolina kept something few queens would dare admit to owning. A glass vial filled with her husband's sweat. Yes, sweat. Bottled. labelled treasured. Ferdinand IV wasn't exactly an Adonis. He was described by contemporaries as simple, earthy, and wildly unsophisticated. He preferred hunting and fishing to diplomacy, and once reportedly dined shirtless among his ministers just to see how they'd react. But despite his quirks, or maybe because of them, Maria Karolina adored him. She claimed his scent calmed her, that it reminded her of the earth, that when he left for war or state travel, she could sleep only by placing a silk cloth he had sweated into beneath her pillow. Eventually she asked for something more permanent, something she could keep near her heart. The court physician, perhaps regretting his career choices, obliged, using a linen band placed under the king's armpits during a long afternoon of falconry. He collected enough sweat to fill a small apothecary bottle. It was sealed with beeswax, stored in a velvet-lined case, and delivered with a note that read, "A gift of essence." Maria Karolina reportedly wept. What started as a one-time indulgence turned into a habit. She began collecting more essence bottles, each tagged with the date and occasion. There's one from his birthday hunt, one from a state dinner, even one marked Night of Storm. She claimed they all smelled slightly different, and memorised each scent. When Ferdinand returned from travels, she'd uncork one at random and try to guess the occasion, like a disturbingly intimate game of royal trivia. Now, before you assume this was a one-woman olfactory obsession, it's worth noting that bodily fluids weren't always taboo in royal circles. In many courts, monarchs believed their sweat, blood, and even tears carried divine or curative power. French kings reportedly blessed the sick with their touch. English queens drank virgin's milk as part of fertility rituals. Some rulers even sent jars of their saliva to alchemists for spiritual analysis. But Maria Karolina's sweat collection stands out because it was not medicinal, nor ceremonial. It was personal. She didn't hide it. Visitors to the palace would sometimes be shown her essence chest, a gilded cabinet with drawers for each vial. Diplomats from Austria and Spain wrote home about the peculiar treasures the Queen kept beside her prayer books. One particularly flustered envoy called it a shrine of moisture. Even her children knew of the collection. Her daughter, Maria Amalia, once told a tutor that Mama keeps Papa's spirit in little bottles. There's even a portrait, now tucked away in a private collection in Sicily, that allegedly shows Maria Karolina seated beside the cabinet, holding one of the vials between gloved fingers, smiling faintly. It's a quiet, eerie image. Not grand, not regal, just odd. What drove this devotion? Some historians suggest Maria Karolina had an unusually acute sense of smell. There are records of her identifying foreign dignitaries by scent alone, sometimes before they spoke. She banned lilies from the palace because she claimed they clouded her thoughts, but others believe it was an emotional coping mechanism. Ferdinand was often absent, and Maria Karolina was burdened with statecraft, children, and endless court intrigue. Her bottles were tokens, anchors, and yet they weren't entirely safe. During a brief rebellion in Naples, rioters looted parts of the royal residence. Several of the sweat vials were smashed, their contents spilled onto marble and linen. When Maria Karolina returned, she reportedly collapsed upon seeing the wreckage. For days she refused to eat, claiming his soul had been poured upon the stones. New vials were made, but the original Storm Night bottle was never replaced. Even more bizarre, a few of the surviving vials were analysed in the 20th century by a curious pathologist. His conclusion: the contents were indeed biological, containing trace amounts of urea, salt, and epithelial cells. A few samples also showed signs of lavender oil and citrus, possibly used to mask the natural scent, or perhaps added by the Queen herself. One bottle contained something unexpected, a single eyelash. Whether this was deliberate or incidental is unknown, but the pathologist, clearly unsettled, titled his paper Relics of Intimacy, an Analysis of Royal Sweat. Maria Karolina wasn't the only royal to treat sweat as sacred. In the Mughal Empire, Emperor Jahangir once gifted his favourite wife, Nur Jahan, a handkerchief he'd worn during an elephant hunt. She had it framed and kept it beside her bed. When she died, the cloth was buried with her. A later excavation revealed it still bore faint stains, and was, disturbingly, still scented with musk and something else, unidentifiable but oddly warm. In France, Empress Josephine reportedly collected Napoleon's handkerchiefs, unwashed, folded neatly in a cedar chest. One was said to have a full outline of his palm dark with dried sweat. She referred to them as the touch of my conqueror. Even in Victorian England, Prince Albert gifted Queen Victoria with his worn riding gloves. She wrote in her diary, "I smell his courage." But no collection matched the scale and detail of Maria Karolina's. After her death, the essence chest was locked, sealed, and moved to a convent for safekeeping. Nuns there, unsure of what they were guarding, believed the vials held sacred oils or relics. They kept them dusted, arranged alphabetically by date. It wasn't until the 1800s, during an inventory, that a curious priest opened one, sniffed it, and promptly passed out. Some were discarded, others vanished into private hands. A few, 4 to be exact, remain preserved in a museum vault in Naples, labelled as perfumed tinctures. But those who've studied them know better. They're not perfume, they're memories, preserved in salt and time. Disturbing? Absolutely. But also oddly romantic. In a world where royal love was often arranged, performed, or political, Maria Karolina clung to something raw, something real, something warm, musky, and slightly alarming. Because sometimes love isn't a letter or a jewel. Sometimes it's a drop of sweat in a bottle, a scent that says, "I remember you exactly as you were." And maybe, just maybe, someone out there still wears a locket filled with their beloved's cologne-soaked handkerchief. A modern echo of a queen who believed you could bottle affection, seal devotion, and breathe your way back to the one you loved. At most royal banquets, guests expect a little tension, awkward glances between rival duchesses, passive-aggressive toasts, the occasional undercooked goose. But at one deeply unsettling court, the unease came not from the food itself, but from the strange metallic device perched beside every plate, a polished brass scale gleaming ominously under candlelight. This was no centerpiece. It was an instrument of fear. Welcome to the court of Tsar Paul I of Russia, ruler of paranoia, practitioner of punishments, and inventor of a dinner ritual known as tongue-weighing. Paul I, son of the legendary Catherine the Great, ascended the throne in 1796 after decades of resentment and suspicion. He inherited an empire vast in territory and volatile in temperament, and ruled it with a blend of manic energy, elaborate etiquette, and startling unpredictability. One of his lesser-known but most disturbing innovations was a nightly ritual that historians still struggle to explain, a ceremony of enforced silence and symbolic submission. It began, innocently enough, as an etiquette reform. Paul believed the Russian nobility had grown too comfortable, too chatty, too clever for their own good. He feared loose tongues could unravel his power, so he set out to tame them, literally. At dinners in the Mikhailovsky castle, he introduced the weighing of words, a bizarre performance that required each guest, before the first course, to place their tongue on a small golden scale. This wasn't metaphor. This was protocol. Servants carried the scales, one per table, and guests were summoned in order of rank. A scribe stood nearby to note the measurement. No one knows exactly what was recorded, but letters from the time reference acceptable weight and balanced temperament. Those whose tongues were judged too light were dismissed from the table. Too heavy? They were given a warning. Temper your speech, lest your words sink your station. Whether the scale was rigged or simply ceremonial, no one could say. But guests were terrified. Some reportedly fasted before banquets, believing a dry mouth might yield a better result. Others licked lemon juice before the ritual, hoping it would contract their tongues and shave off a fraction of weight. Of course, some dared to mock the ritual in private. One duke, known for his sarcasm, reportedly whispered, "Let us weigh the brain next and see which of us remains." He was reassigned to a Siberian outpost the next week. The Tsar himself participated. Before every meal he would approach the main scale, nod to his guests, and solemnly place his own tongue upon the tray. A hush would fall. The scribe would write. Then the Tsar would smile faintly and say, "Let us proceed." The mouth is measured, the soul is still. It was theatre, power performance, psychological warfare wrapped in gold. The ritual didn't stop there. Throughout the meal, guests were permitted to speak only if granted permission. If a guest made an unsolicited remark, even something as harmless as a compliment on the soup, they might be summoned again to the scale. This time the weighing would be public, and humiliating. In one documented case, a baroness was made to weigh her tongue twice in one evening. On the second weighing, the Tsar reportedly leaned forward and asked, "Have your words grown heavier with pride?" She did not return to court after that. Another account written in the diary of a Polish envoy describes a nobleman who refused to participate, calling the ritual childish tyranny. He was promptly removed by guards, his plate smashed on the floor. That same night, a full roasted boar was served with its tongue displayed prominently on a silver platter. No explanation was offered. The message was clear. Scholars debate the psychological roots of this ritual. Some say it was a manifestation of Paul's increasing paranoia. Others believe he was trying to create a visual metaphor for court loyalty, a way to remind guests that every word had weight, and that weight could be measured. One fringe theory suggests the Tsar believed tongues held spiritual energy, and that by weighing them, he could detect deceit or treasonous thought. This idea is supported by strange marginal notes in Paul's personal papers, which include phrases like "tongue curved equals soul curved" and "the metal remembers the mood." There's even a story, likely apocryphal, of a guest whose tongue tipped the scale too far. Paul allegedly ordered the man to spend a night in solitary confinement, reflecting on the heaviness of his thoughts. When he returned to court, the guest spoke in whispers for the rest of his life, but the most haunting detail comes from a court artist, tasked with sketching the dinner rituals for a commemorative album. His surviving drafts show not smiling nobles, but rows of stiff-backed guests, pale and tight-lipped, with scales like little altars at their places. He included a sketch of the Tsar's personal scale, larger than the others, flanked by candelabras, with tiny inscriptions etched around the rim. One reads, "Silence is the noblest jewel." It's said that when Paula was assassinated in 1801, strangled in his bedroom by disaffected nobles, the first thing his conspirators did was smash the ceremonial scales. They were seen as symbols of his descent into tyranny, a tangible metaphor for his obsession with control. And yet, the concept lingered. In smaller courts, imitators emerged. In Prussia, a minor duke introduced a weighing of the pen, where guests had to dip their quills in ink and touch them to a scale before signing official documents. In Florence, a salon hostess created a party game inspired by Paul's ritual, though hers used chocolate coins and much laughter. But none captured the chilling tone of the original. In the Hermitage Museum today, tucked in a side cabinet often overlooked by tourists, sits a tiny golden scale said to be one of Paul's originals. The balance arms are delicate, the trays worn smooth. There is no explanatory placard. Just a small folded paper resting beside it, with a quote written in Cyrillic: "A measured tongue rarely spills the truth. Whether you believe in the power of such symbols or not, the message is clear. In some courts, your words could weigh you down. Literally." So the next time you're tempted to speak your mind at dinner, consider the strange legacy of Tsar Paul III and maybe glance under your plate. Just in case. There's eating to survive, there's eating to indulge, and then there's eating to transcend. For a few royals scattered through history, food wasn't just nutrition or pleasure. It was a spiritual ladder, a ritual, a performance of belief. And sometimes it involved dirt. Literal scoop it up from the garden, soil between your teeth dirt. Our first stop is the strange and saintly world of Christina Mirabilis, a Flemish ascetic of the 12th century who, though never technically royal, was venerated by nobles across Europe, particularly in the courts of the Holy Roman Empire. Known for her extreme devotion and reported levitations, she also partook in what she called the holy consumption of the earth. Christina would lie face down in freshly dug graves, scooping handfuls of soil into her mouth and whispering prayers between bites. She claimed the soil cleansed her soul, reminded her of mortality, and connected her teeth to God's patience. Monarchs sent her blessed earth from their lands, hoping her consumption would sanctify their rule. Emperor Henry VI even sent a casket of Rhine River mud. She reportedly said it tasted of proud wine and weak promises. As eccentric as Christina's rituals were, the royal appetite for such symbolism only grew. Fast forward to the 18th century, where King Gustav III of Sweden, the same Gustav who once conducted a caffeine experiment using condemned prisoners, adopted a curious dietary regimen based on spiritual purity. Deeply superstitious and fascinated by Eastern mysticism, he developed a belief that earthly decay could be reversed by returning man's gut to Eden. Translation: he ate clay, specifically kaolin, a soft, white, mineral-rich clay used today in ceramics and sometimes medicine. Gustav insisted his personal chefs include small amounts of powdered clay in soups and sauces, and occasionally drank warm water infused with it. He believed it absorbed sin, cleansed ambition, and coated the soul like ivory. Servants were less enthused. The royal kitchen often smelled faintly of pottery. Guests complained of chalky textures in their stews. But Gustav was undeterred. He even composed a poem about his favourite blend: clay of the righteous, grit of grace, smooth the thorns that line my place. One surviving court recipe: saint's broth, veal stock, leeks, fennel, white pepper, and 3 tablespoons of edible earth. But Gustav wasn't the only monarch to dine on the inedible. Tsarina Alexandra Fyodorovna, wife of Nicholas II of Russia, followed a regimen in her later years that included small pellets of compressed soil, dried flower petals and crushed bone, given to her by a mystic in Siberia. These divine lozenges, as she called them, were supposed to align her body with the natural vibrations of Russia's sacred land. She kept a tin beside her bed and chewed them slowly before prayers. Her husband, the Tsar, reportedly tried one, grimaced, and politely declined to make it a habit. Alexandra, however, believed they helped her sleep. She even had a pouch of the lozenges sewn into her coronation robes for grounding strength. Historians point to Rasputin's influence. The mystic favoured herbal earth brews and often declared, "All poison begins above the ground." His remedies included teas steeped with moss, mould, and what he called black soil of prophecy. Alexandra's diet slowly absorbed these teachings, until even her midday snacks included earthly truffles, dates rolled in honey and sprinkled with pulverised beetroot and forest humus. One guest who tried them said it tasted like sugar dusted with despair. Not all dirt-based diets were mystical. In the 16th century, Polish king Sigismund II Augustus dabbled in what was then called geophagia, the deliberate consumption of earth, often during times of emotional or spiritual stress. After the death of his beloved wife Barbara Radziwiłł, Sigismund entered a mourning so intense that his court feared he would starve himself. Instead, he began consuming small amounts of graveyard clay, taken from the chapel where Barbara had been buried. Not for nourishment, but for proximity. He would mix it into wine, or press it into little cakes with honey and cinnamon. When asked why, he reportedly replied, "It is her dust, and I am not yet done with her." Whether this act was spiritual communion or psychological collapse remains debated, but the record is clear. The king's diet became increasingly symbolic, increasingly earthbound. It wasn't just Europe. In the courts of ancient Japan, some Shinto-aligned nobles practiced tsuchikui, earth-eating, as part of certain fertility or purification rites. Clay tablets inscribed with prayers were crushed and swallowed, often alongside rice wine. Emperors were not exempt. In one ceremony, Emperor Seiwa of the 9th century consumed 3 prayer tiles, in a moonlit ritual meant to ensure his line would thrive. The recipe, recorded in ancient scrolls: rice flour, powdered stone, and water from a shrine basin. The texture? Like regret softened with rice. Even the Aztecs, whose emperors lived in volcanic splendour, consumed sacred dirt from lake beds believed to house the bones of gods. Moctezuma II reportedly had jars of divine silt brought from Lake Texcoco. It was mixed with amaranth and chewed during rituals honouring the dead. Spanish invaders were horrified, assuming it was ash. It wasn't, but the practice vanished with the empire. Modern science acknowledges that certain clays can bind toxins or soothe digestion. But for these monarchs, the reasons went beyond biology. To eat dirt was to humble oneself, to ingest the very thing beneath their thrones, to taste the end of all things, death, rebirth, empire. And it wasn't just about physical consumption. Royal gardens were often designed to mimic the spiritual geography of their kingdoms. At Versailles, it's rumoured that Louis XIV once chewed rose-scented mud balls during solar ceremonies, though this may be more poetic myth than proven fact. But the strangest recorded case of all? King Charles X of France, the last of the Bourbon line before the July Revolution, was known to eat chalk. Not clay, not earth, just simple schoolroom chalk, scraped from the walls of his personal chapel. He claimed it kept his voice clear and his conscience cleaner. Once, during a sermon, he reached into his pocket and popped a piece mid-prayer. His chaplain paused in horror. Charles smiled and said, "The soul tastes best when grounded." After his abdication, exiled and wandering through Europe, he carried a pouch of it with him. When he died in 1836, the bag was found in his waistcoat, half full. Today, we might call it pica, a psychological condition marked by the craving of non-nutritive substances. But in the royal context, it becomes something else, a form of spiritual defiance, a belief that the highest among us must, from time to time, eat the lowliest thing. Because sometimes kings and queens needed to taste the dirt to remember who they were, or who they once were, or who they would someday become. And maybe, just maybe, the next time you see a child nibbling on a bit of garden soil, you're not witnessing mischief. You're glimpsing a ritual as old as monarchy, a return to the root, to the rot, to the realm from which all empires rise and fall. You might think being a jester at a royal court was all laughter and feathered hats, a little juggling, a few fart jokes, maybe a drunken limerick or two. But in some courts, especially under particularly mercurial monarchs, the role of the jester was less comedian and more walking target. Because as it turns out, laughter didn't always protect you. In some royal households, it could kill you. Let's open this section with a story that would be comical if it weren't so macabre. The tale of Triboulet, the famed court fool of King Francis I of France. Triboulet was more than a clown. He was a licensed provocateur, a master of wordplay, and a sharp observer of the French court's hypocrisies. He once insulted a duchess so thoroughly with a single rhyme that she demanded his execution. Francis, half amused and half trapped by protocol, agreed to the punishment. But in a rare gesture of gallows humour, he offered Triboulet a choice in how he wished to die. The jester, without missing a beat, said, "By old age." Francis laughed so hard he pardoned him on the spot. Lucky for Triboulet, because many jesters weren't so fortunate. Take the court of Ivan the Terrible, who, true to his name, wasn't exactly known for his subtle sense of humour. His jester, nicknamed Skuratov, was allowed to mock the Tsar only during specific hours of the day. If he made a joke even a minute too early, or, heaven forbid, a minute too late, it was considered insubordination. One chilling entry in the Tsar's private diary reads, "The fool dared laugh past vespers." The bells toll for him now. Skuratov was beaten and exiled to a monastery, where he lived out his remaining days in silence. A cruel twist of fate for someone whose job was to speak truth wrapped in comedy. And Ivan wasn't alone. In Tudor England, jesters like Will Sommers walked a dangerous tightrope, navigating the volatile moods of Henry VIII. Sommers was clever, he couched his jabs in riddles and puns, but even he knew that a poorly timed barb could mean the Tower of London. There's one particularly infamous evening when Henry, bloated and irritable, was complaining about foreign diplomats. Sommers quipped, "Perhaps they avoid your court because they fear being mistaken for a second Turkey." The room froze. Henry narrowed his eyes. Then miraculously he chuckled. Barely. The next day, Sommers retired for a fortnight. Whether by choice or suggestion is unclear. In Spain, jesters were often dwarfs, or people with physical deformities, considered holy fools, due to a twisted belief that their bodies bore divine marks. But their comedy came with risk. King Philip IV had a court jester named Diego de Acedo, known as El Primo, who was allowed to accompany the king on hunts, and even into battle camps. One day, after a failed joke about the Queen's shoes, Diego was sent back to the palace with a single message. Let silence be his new routine. He was never seen at court again, but perhaps the darkest example of laughter used as a blade comes from the Ottoman Empire. Under Sultan Ibrahim IV, often dubbed Ibrahim the Mad, jesters were tasked with keeping the court entertained during increasingly erratic episodes. One jester, named Nasu, told a joke about the Sultan's prized elephant, comparing its dance to the vizier's gait. The Sultan laughed uproariously, then ordered the jester to be sewn into a sack and thrown into the Bosphorus. Why? He later explained that a perfect joke should float forever. Court scribes, unsure whether to record this as metaphor or murder, wrote it down as both. The pattern is clear. When monarchs felt secure, they laughed freely. When they felt paranoid, isolated, or threatened, humour became treason. And jesters, who lived by their tongues, often died by them too. One fringe theory among historians is that jesters were unofficial royal therapists, allowed to speak the unspoken. Their deaths, then, were not just acts of rage, but symbolic silencing. The end of candour, a loud laugh followed by a louder silence. There's even a term in some Renaissance letters, the crimson giggle, a euphemism for executions following a jester's failed performance. Even the clothing didn't help. The jingle of bells, once charming, could become a death knell. In the court of Emperor Rudolf II of the Holy Roman Empire, a jester named Clewitz was known for elaborate pantomimes involving puppets dressed as ministers. One evening, his puppet king stumbled off a fake throne. The audience roared. The emperor did not. Clewitz was stripped of his motley, his puppets burned, and he was forced to live as a groundskeeper. But not all interactions ended in tragedy. Frederick the Great of Prussia had a jester named Curl who specialised in impressions. His impression of the king, complete with powdered wig, strutting gait and exaggerated Prussian bark, was so popular that Frederick once disguised himself and watched the act anonymously. When he revealed himself, Curl dropped to his knees, expecting exile. Frederick merely clapped and said, "At least someone has the courage to correct my posture." Still, such mercy was rare. A surviving letter from the court of Peter the Great of Russia details an event known as the Festival of Silence, where jesters were paraded through the palace wearing muzzles. It was meant to mock nobles who had criticised the Tsar's policies. The jesters, bound and mute, had to mime their routines while courtiers laughed nervously. One jester, unable to suppress a frustrated grunt, was removed and never returned. His name is lost, but the muzzle survives. On display in a Moscow museum, labelled Instrument of Mirth. Why did monarchs turn so violently on their fools? Perhaps because the jester saw too much. Their humour-pierced veils exposed insecurities, mirrored hypocrisy. They were mirrors, often distorted, yes, but honest in a way no adviser dared to be. To laugh with a king was to hold a blade and hope it didn't reflect too brightly, and yet the role endured. Even today, heads of state have roasts, satirical correspondence, late-night comics. The jester never vanished. He simply moved stages, but his risks remain. A joke, at the wrong moment, in the wrong room, still has the power to exile, to end, to echo. So the next time someone makes you laugh just a little too hard at a truth you'd rather ignore, tip your hat, metaphorically, to those royal jesters who risked everything for a chuckle. Some made kings smile, some made them think, some made them disappear. And all of them, in their own bizarre way, proved that the sharpest crown sits not on the head, but on the tip of a very clever tongue. In a kingdom known for mosques, minarets, and marble, the royal wedding registry once included a tree. Yes, a tree. Of all the eccentricities born in the golden age of empire, few can top the story of Sultan Ibrahim. Two of the Ottoman Empire who, during a brief and extremely peculiar period of governance, married a tree in a full religious ceremony. Not as a metaphor, not as an artistic stunt, as an official, recorded, state-sanctioned royal marriage. Let's back up. Ibrahim II, also known as Ibrahim the Mad, ruled from 1640 to 1648 and was the younger brother of Sultan Murad IV, a ruler infamous for banning coffee, tobacco and alcohol, and for executing violators personally. When Murad died, Ibrahim, who had spent most of his adult life confined in a palace suite under what the Ottomans called kafes, literally the keşeisund, the cage, suddenly found himself elevated from solitary prince to absolute ruler of a massive empire. And if that transition sounds traumatic, that's because it was. Ibrahim had emerged from his long confinement already mentally fragile. He reportedly spoke to furniture, wept over carpets, and asked birds if they believed in justice. But his behaviours escalated quickly once he assumed power, and nowhere was that more evident than in his approach to relationships. He had an enormous harem, by some reports over 280 women, and he was obsessed with procreation, so much so that he consulted mystics, spiritualists and healers about fertility. One dervish suggested that Ibrahim's root needed grounding. The Sultan interpreted this literally. Shortly thereafter, the wedding was announced. The bride was a fig tree. Not just any fig tree, mind you, but one carefully chosen by court botanists. It had a thick, curvaceous trunk, a dramatic canopy, and, according to Ibrahim, a gaze that whispers. He named her Perihan, which loosely translates to Queen of the Fairies. A canopy was erected around the tree in the imperial gardens. Perfumed garments were hung from its limbs, and a ceremonial bridal veil was draped over the upper branches. The Grand Vizier, attempting to keep order while appeasing a volatile monarch, arranged for a formal marriage contract. Court poets were summoned to compose wedding hymns. Musicians played softly under the branches, and yes, an imam performed the nikah, the Islamic marriage ceremony. Whether he truly believed he was marrying a tree to a man, or simply valued his own neck too much to protest, we may never know. Gifts were presented: silk ribbons, exotic birds, and a jewelled watering can. Palace attendants brought soil from different regions of the empire to bless the bride's roots. For weeks afterward, Ibrahim would visit her daily, leaving dates, almonds, and sugar cubes nestled in the branches. He was often seen whispering to Perihan, kissing the bark and occasionally reciting verses from the Quran while stroking her leaves. One court scribe claimed the Sultan once ordered a tailor to sew tiny slippers and place them at the base of the tree. "She walks in dreams," he reportedly said. Naturally, this sparked concern. The Ottoman court was no stranger to eccentric rulers. Madness often mingled with divinity in their mythology. But Ibrahim's behaviour teetered into dangerous absurdity. His obsession with Perihan began affecting policy. He diverted funds from military campaigns to construct a crystal gazebo nearby, so she may hear music during the wind. He banned the harvesting of figs within the capital, calling it cannibalism of kin. One particularly bizarre decree stated that any tree found growing in the imperial gardens without sufficient grace should be shamed with silence, which, according to his attendants, meant no music or conversation was permitted within 10 paces of an unworthy plant. While this might sound like the fever dream of a surrealist poet, it is recorded, albeit obliquely, in Ottoman chronicles. Court historian Evliya Çelebi, known for both his wit and his eye for detail, writes that Ibrahim's affections took root where blossoms know no breath. The phrasing is cryptic, but clear enough to hint at the absurd truth. The wedding, however, was not the end. Rumours swirled that Ibrahim slept beneath the tree's canopy during storms, declaring that "her limbs protect me from thunder's jealousy." One guard recounted an incident where the Sultan accused a squirrel of flirting with his wife and ordered its exile from the palace grounds. Eventually, Perihan began to wither. Fig trees, it turns out, do not thrive on devotion alone. Her bark cracked, her fruit shriveled. When she lost a major limb during a windstorm, Ibrahim was inconsolable. He declared a week of mourning and wore green silk robes in her honour. He ordered the fallen branch to be wrapped in gold leaf and placed in the royal treasury. But the empire was losing patience. By this point, the Janissaries, the elite military corps, were disgruntled. The Grand Vizier walked a political tightrope between indulging the Sultan's whims and preventing outright rebellion. Eventually, a faction within the palace plotted to remove Ibrahim. He was deposed in 1648, just 8 years after ascending the throne. His final days were spent in confinement, ironically, in a mirrored chamber where no trees were allowed. As for Perihan, after Ibrahim's removal, she was quietly uprooted and taken to an undisclosed garden. Some say she was burned as a cautionary symbol. Others claim a sympathetic gardener replanted her near the Sea of Marmara, where she lived out her days in relative peace. A single fig seed from her fruit was allegedly preserved in a royal herbarium, labelled only with the initials PH and the date of the wedding. Modern psychologists have speculated endlessly on Ibrahim's condition: schizophrenia, delusional disorder, trauma-induced psychosis from his cafe's years, all plausible. But within the context of his empire, where the line between divine mandate and madness was often thin, his arboreal union became legend. The concept of tree marriage isn't unique to the Ottomans either. In parts of India, the practice of marrying a person to a tree still exists, usually to appease astrological signs or correct unlucky charts. In 2001, Bollywood actress Aishwarya Rai was briefly married to a tree before her actual wedding, to offset the malefic influence of Mars in her horoscope. The tree was later cut down in protest. As in all symbolic rituals, belief is both currency and curse. In medieval England, there are references, likely satirical, to woodwives, women accused of marrying trees during pagan ceremonies. In Norse mythology, the first humans were shaped from trees, and in ancient Greece, dryads, tree nymphs, were often depicted as lovers of mortal men. But none of these tales had the legal framework, court witnesses, and poetic documentation that accompanied Perihan's big day. So while most royal weddings are remembered for their splendour, their politics, their unions of blood and empire, Sultan Ibrahim's remains singular, a marriage not of convenience or conquest, but of delusion wrapped in bark and blessed by birdsong. And somewhere, in the roots of a forgotten fig grove, perhaps the wind still rustles with a whisper only one man ever understood. My Sultan, my leaves remember. A gentle sigh, a soft hiss of escaping air, a quiet belch, sounds easily ignored in most settings. But when they rise from beneath a stone floor in a crypt sealed for centuries, they have a tendency to draw attention. And when that crypt holds the remains of a royal family, and the moaning seems almost conversational, then you've entered the unsettling story of the royal grave that burps. Tucked beneath the towering nave of St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna is the crypt of the Habsburg dynasty, one of Europe's most powerful and inbred royal houses. For hundreds of years, emperors, empresses, archdukes and royal children were interred there, laid to rest in ornate metal sarcophagi shaped like coffins, cradles, and even giant crustaceans. Some are topped with gilded skulls and angelic cherubs, others simply bear a cross and a name. But beneath all that pomp lies something far more corporeal: decay. The Habsburgs, like many royals, were embalmed with care, but the techniques varied. Some bodies were dried with herbs and alcohol, others soaked in waxes or perfumes, still others were barely touched at all. In certain cases, internal organs were removed and stored separately in urns. Over time, this cocktail of preservation and a general misunderstanding of how gases work gave rise to one of the strangest phenomena in European funeral history. Because once sealed in the crypt, sometimes for centuries, these bodies began to emit noises. Staff who work at the Capuchin crypt have long told whispered stories of strange sounds echoing in the dark. Most of the time it's creaking, occasionally a bang, but every so often the air shifts and a noise rises from beneath the sarcophagi, a hollow, breathy erg, followed by a gurgling sigh. Some call it the imperial exhale. Others, more humorously, call it the Habsburg burp. The science is straightforward. Gases build up inside decaying bodies even when embalmed. Temperature shifts in the crypt cause pressure changes, and the elaborate metal sarcophagi, designed with vents and intricate seals, sometimes allow those gases to escape with a dramatic wheeze. But for the caretakers of the crypt, it's more than a natural process. It's personal. One long-time groundskeeper recounted a story of lighting candles for a tour group when a loud whoomph echoed behind him. The guests screamed, a candle toppled, a small painting fell from the wall. When he turned around, the sarcophagus of Emperor Leopold I stood as it had for centuries, silent, still, but undeniably expressive. He later told a journalist, "It sounded like a man clearing his throat before making a speech." The phenomenon happens most often during periods of heat followed by a rapid drop in pressure. Summer thunderstorms, typically. Tourists have reported hearing distant sighs or low voices. Most brush it off, but a few insist they felt a breeze on their ankles or a whisper in their ears, even though no one was nearby. It would all seem laughable, if not for the Habsburgs' obsession with their own afterlives. The dynasty had an entire ritual designed to reinforce the sacredness of their bones. Upon the death of an emperor, the body was divided, heart, entrails and corpse buried in 3 different locations. The heart went to the Augustinian church, the entrails to St. Stephen's, the body to the Capuchin crypt. This created what some scholars call a holy triangulation of decomposition, and decomposition was never discussed. In royal letters, the dead were always described as at rest, in eternal vigilance, or awaiting resurrection. The idea that their tombs might belch or wheeze was considered sacrilege, which makes the sounds that much more eerie because they're unavoidable. Perhaps the most infamous incident occurred in 1960, when researchers opened the sarcophagus of Maria Theresa, the only female ruler of the Habsburgs and a formidable monarch. Upon cracking the seal, a blast of gas erupted so forcefully that one historian dropped his notebook and fainted. The air smelled of myrrh, mould, and iron. One of the attendants later joked, "She always had the last word." Maria Theresa's tomb remains one of the largest in the crypt, decorated with mourning cherubs and bronze laurels. It's also one of the loudest. Multiple attendants have reported soft thumps or clicks coming from within. The church officially attributes these to environmental settling. But still, one wonders. Further afield, other royal graves have their own sonic reputations. In Scotland, the tomb of Mary, Queen of Scots at Westminster Abbey, has long been the subject of spectral whispers. Visitors occasionally report hearing a woman's voice reciting psalms. Experts chalk it up to airflow and acoustics. Still, the abbey refuses to allow nighttime tours. In Denmark, King Christian IV's vault reportedly groans during full moons. A local guide claimed it was due to shifting earth, but also admitted he always hated being ignored. But none are quite as gassy or as unnervingly human as the Habsburg crypt. There's something oddly appropriate about it. The Habsburgs ruled vast swathes of Europe. They intermarried until their jaws jutted and their bloodlines blurred. They orchestrated alliances, declared wars, and built palaces so grand that the ceilings had their own echo chambers. And in death, they're still making noise. Some say it's a reminder that the past is never silent, that power leaves echoes, that no matter how many titles you acquire, Archduke of Austria, King of Bohemia, Defender of the Holy Roman Empire, your body still bubbles in the dark. Others say it's a warning, that burying your secrets in bronze doesn't keep them from seeping out. One more curious note. In 2018, during a heatwave, sensors in the crypt recorded a series of pressure fluctuations, followed by a burst that set off the fire alarms. There was no smoke, no flames, just a hissing sigh, loud enough to be mistaken for combustion. The fire brigade found nothing. One firefighter later remarked, "It sounded like someone giving up." And yet, the Capuchin monks who care for the crypt treat it all with quiet reverence. They light candles, dust the sarcophagi, and ignore the occasional cough from the shadows. After all, the dead are only resting. They just have a lot to say. So if you ever find yourself walking through the Habsburg vaults, and the air suddenly thickens, and a wheeze slips through the quiet, don't be alarmed. It's just centuries of royalty, sighing in chorus, perhaps in boredom, or indigestion. Either way, they're still with us. No crown required. And now, dear Night Owl, as the last ember of our candlelight flickers, and the weight of all those crowns and curiosities settles gently in the stillness, we slow our breath and ease our minds. The whispering tombs, the whispered secrets, the whispers themselves. None of them follow you now. They stay in their crypts, in their mirrored halls, in their velvet-lined insanity. You've walked with emperors and eccentrics, tasted their chalk, inhaled their perfumes, and survived their rituals. You've watched kings marry trees, queens bottle sweat, jesters tiptoe through terror. What a strange, magnificent pageant it has been. Let it fade now. Let the fig trees rustle softly in a breeze far away. Let the golden scales gather dust. Let the mirrored rooms dim into shadow. They were always meant to live only in the corners of our curiosity, never our reality. You are safe. You are still. And the only echo tonight is your breath. No need to weigh your tongue. No need to bottle your thoughts. Just let them go. Let them drift like incense smoke curling through time. Because the world of royal absurdity is vast. But your bed is warmer, your room quieter, your dreams far kinder. Close your eyes. Breathe slower. You've done enough for one evening. Let the absurdities slip into mist. Let the giggling ghosts and burping emperors fall silent. The night is yours now.